All right, everyone, we apologize for the delay. We have all of our technology, or we've caught up with the technology. We're going to call to order at 5:44. We'll go ahead and begin with our attendance. Mark Moore, Melissa Pino, Glenn Conrad, Clint Rutherford is absent, excused. Joe Denman, Derek Green, Pete Gaddy, I'm present. Kathy Watson, Kerry Freeland,
Here.
Michael Lewis, absent. Yes, and Eileen Beard. Staff present is Robert Turpin and Mark Nicholas. Mr. Secretary. All righty. Third item is the. Do we have a major echo here? Or is it just me? Okay.
He's trying to work on it now.
Yeah. All right. Next item is number 3, the approval of the March 13th minutes. Do we have any amendments or recommendation for approval? I think it has to do with the
Like a Pink
recording.
Floyd concert.
I put my earbuds in so I don't hear it, I guess. Okay, so Mr. Moore is making a motion to approve the minutes. Do we have a second? Ms. Pino, is there a second? All in favor? I will abstain because I was absent from last month's meeting. Okay, we have our much anticipated seafood safety public workshop. I'd like to thank everyone that has put that together. And from my understanding is we have 2 attendees, experts via Teams meetings, and then we have 3 that are present with us currently. And in the interest of time, considering we've already lost 20 minutes, and out of respect for our experts, I think that it would be best to we're going to just go ahead and hold our questions till the end as a panel discussion, and we also have the item of nominations and elections of officers for our board, which I would make the recommendation that we push to the May meeting in the interest of our experts' time and them willing to come out and educate us about seafood safety. Robert?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I remind myself, I'll remind everyone, please turn your cell phones off, or if they're able to be silenced, if you would please do that. And I hope that this takes. Nothing worse than being in the middle of a room full of people and have your cell phone going off. That'll probably happen to me because I've said that and jinxed myself. In the back, and we'll introduce her as our newest employee with the Escambia County Natural Resources Management Department. She's spending 20 hours a week with Marine Resources Conservation or Marine Resources Management, and then she's spending also the other 20 hours per week with the Sea Turtle and Habitat Conservation Plan out on Perdido Key. So, Kendall, if you would, please bring up my presentation.
Has to be brought up on that screen.
Okay.
I can't do anything with that if y'all aren't in Microsoft Teams.
And this is the first time that we've tried a hybrid meeting for the Marine Advisory Committee, so I'll apologize to the audience and the Marine Advisory Committee that we are learning as we go, and we had to, due to the limitations of our equipment, we had to have actually 2 systems going at the same time. This is Kindle, everybody. See, now is when I should have learned to tap dance when I was younger, but I can't tap dance, so I'm just going to have to stand here and look very uncomfortable as we get this presentation up. So welcome everyone to the 2023 Escambia County Seafood Safety Symposium. This is, I don't have an exact count of the number of these that we've done, but I was talking to Keith Milley here earlier today, and the first one I believe was sometime around 2010. And we had more presenters than we had audience participation. So it's nice to see more people in the audience tonight as well as our presenters. But we've done at least a half a dozen of these seafood safety symposia, and we do them now in conjunction with the Marine Advisory Committee meetings, because the Marine Advisory Committee meetings are the appointees by the Board of County Commissioners and County Administrator that advise the Board of County Commissioners. So having them a captive audience as well is good for all of our input. And Chips Kirschenfeld, our department director, was going to be here tonight to welcome you all, but he's unfortunately had a schedule conflict. But he did want to ask me to mention the recent media that has covered various things about seafood in local waterways. There was a recent media publication about a Florida International University study that found pharmaceuticals in redfish and bonefish, and one of the estuaries that they studied was Pensacola Bay System. So, these are not only are they items of interest to the press, but as you'll see when I get to my presentation, these are items that are personal to me and my family, and I believe that are important for most of us who consume seafood or have family that consume seafood. So with that, I'll go ahead and get right into my presentation, and if you would, next slide, please. So this is our agenda for tonight. I'm going to give a talk about the sources of information, and then we're going to have an overview of the seafood hazard program, the regulations that go with the critical point hazard analysis and critical point regulations that are in the commercial industry that help us ensure that our seafood that comes through our commercial sources is safe. And then also we'll have a presentation about harmful algal blooms and some of the natural toxins that may be present in seafood. And then we'll go into a presentation from the Florida Division of Aquaculture that actually shows how they manage our shellfish harvesting waters to ensure safety. And then one of the studies that was funded from the Escambia County was a study about the couple of species of Vibrio that are present in our system as well as other marine and estuarine waters. And then Keith Milley will talk about the results of our PCB monitoring that we're doing on at the Oriskany Reef. So we'll hold our questions to the end, and we'll have a panel discussion, and we'll have a really good, I think, a very good discussion and some lively question and answers. We do also have some printed materials courtesy of Rick and his team at Sea Grant. And then I have the bios and contact information for all of our speakers on the back table. So if you're interested in getting their email address so you can communicate with them directly, you can write it down, or I just take a picture now. I don't trade business cards. I just take pictures of all that stuff, and it lives on my phone. So next slide. There we go. All right, can you move well, just keep it over. That's over my face anyway. It doesn't matter. So I mentioned that this is important to me. This seafood is part of my diet and part of the diet that I feed my kids. I buy it at one of our, or more than one of our local seafood markets, and I catch it myself. And for all of us who consume seafood, tonight we're going to learn about the health benefits and also the risks that could be associated with consuming seafood. And we know that seafood is healthy. It's healthy proteins. My youngest daughter is into bodybuilding, so she's consuming 150 grams of protein every day to meet her muscle goals. And I bought her, in fact, the day I took this picture, I was buying her a big chunk of tuna. And I let her know that, you know, you're going to eat this tuna, but you're not going to eat any more fish that has mercury in it for the rest of the month, because this is one of the topics. Can we?
I did not do that.
Which one is it coming in on?
Sounds like it right here.
All right, go to that and here, turn the speaker off there. Right here. Right there. Right there. Okay. Hopefully that got it. So one of the sources of seafood is through the fish market, and we catch it ourselves. This is what I had for lunch today. This is a can of tuna, and it's albacore tuna. And one of the things that I learned myself is that different types of tuna have different amounts of mercury in them. So here's another potential way to consume seafood, and we're going to see, and later on in my presentation, go to the next slide, that there's a lot of places to seek that. Can you? There you go. This is from the Florida Department of Health, and you'll see the star there is to our annual seafood consumption guidelines. If you'll go to the next slide, Mark. And this is what the cover of that looks like. The 2021 is still online, and this is hopefully going to scroll to 2022 or 2023 very soon. Next slide. And you're going to need to get rid of that that little window there. There we go. Okay, so this is when you click on it. This is what you get. This is what you get to. And so you'll see it says all coastal waters.
Don't know why it keeps doing it. I'm sorry.
Sometimes that happens when somebody remote is unmuted.
Oh, okay. So Kendall, if you can hear me, if you would mute everybody. And we'll continue on. So this is all coastal waters, and the reason why, you can actually go in there and you can choose a county, but one of the things that I saw was that a lot of these species of fish move, they migrate throughout the state, and we're going to solve this. Start the volume down.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna do. You gotta get out of that. I keep hitting that, but
Okay. That happens to me on my phone sometimes, so nothing like the challenges to derail your thought. So a lot of these species of fish inhabit all of our coastal waters, so that's why I selected all coastal waters. And if you look at the first line for Almaco jack, the women of childbearing age and young children, the number of meals for Almaco jack is 1 per month. And for an adult, that's a 6-ounce portion. And for all other people like me, I get 1 per month. But if you'll look down to one of the others, click to the next slide, please. So for blackfin tuna, for women and children, it's do not eat at all because of mercury. And you see mercury on the right-hand side. That tells you the element of concern. And also cobia. And a lot of people, when we survey our people that attend the local fishing rodeos and other events, we do this survey and we show them. And a lot of people are unaware that these, some of these fish should not be consumed by women of childbearing age and children. And then if you look over the next, for people like me, an old guy that's not in that first category, I can eat one per month. But that doesn't mean that I get to eat one per month of cobia and then I can eat one per month or two per week of stingray. That's all species of fish. So once you've taken your dose of mercury, that's it for the rest of that time period. So you can't just go change species. And what makes that really important is, in a next slide please. Here are the species that do not consume. You got cobia for your women and children. For the rest of us, one per month. King mackerel, 31 inches or more in total length. None of us should eat, and that's fork length, by the way. For those that are between 24 inches, which is the legal limit for king mackerel, so 24 inches to 31 inches is a very narrow size range, and that allows people like me to eat one per month, one meal per month. And then for shark, none of us should eat sharks of any species that are greater than 43 inches. And for those that are less than 43 inches, people like me can eat one meal per month. And go to the next slide. And this is what the regulations are for sharks. So you have to pay attention, and I put a star by sandbar. Sandbar sharks from my underwater reef monitoring are the most abundant shark out there. They're often misidentified as bull sharks. People see a sandbar shark and they think it's a bull shark. Sandbar sharks cannot be harvested, and bull sharks have a minimum 54 inch. So none of us can eat those bull sharks. So you have to look at more than one piece of information to help guide you through these, not only the consumption guidelines, but also through the regulations. Next slide. And then if you go to freshwater, and I don't know why you have to go to freshwater to see the Oriskany, but the Oriskany reef shows bank sea bass. For women of childbearing age, it's do not eat. For people like me, I can eat 2 meals per week. And then for scamp grouper, do not eat is the appropriate advice for women and children, 1 per week for people like me. And you're going to learn a lot more about this when Keith Milley gives his talk, but I wanted to show you that these resources are on the Florida Department of Health's website. Next slide. And then I mentioned that we have a survey, and for the last 10 years, we've been doing surveys at our events, at boat ramps, at fishing rodeos, and other presentations. And we've been collecting information. We ask people, are you aware that there are seafood consumption advisories? That's the first question. Are you aware? Most people are unaware. The second question is, if you are aware, do you use the seafood consumption guidelines? And it's not, I guess, not too surprising that people are aware of them, but they choose to ignore those advisories. And then the next question is for the people that have harvested fish from the Oriskany over the last year. Have you caught by hook and line or spearfished fish from the Oriskany? And then once they answer yes or no to that, then we go through the rest of the survey. But that's the basis for this. And if you're interested in taking the survey tonight, I have copies here tonight, and I would love for anyone to participate in that survey. Next. And then also, if you look at the bottom of the survey, or you just go to Escambia County's webpage, this is our seafood safety page, and we have links to various sources of information. So you can go to myescambia.com and get that. And that's Felicia, our administrative assistant there, with her proud catch of Mingo. Next slide. And I wanted to leave you with some positive and uplifting consumption advisory information. The one species here that is the best, that according to the data, is vermilion snapper, and you can eat one meal per week if you're women and children. And for me, I can eat 2 meals a week. And mingos, Vermilion snapper, some people call them beeliners. They're a great fish. They're abundant. The FWC and the feds have done a good job of managing those populations, so they are sustainable. So that's a real good one to leave you with the consumption advisory. Next slide. And then now to move to freshwater, to the real freshwater, you can select the county and you can see the county water bodies there that are included in the consumption advisory. Next slide. And then I chose the Escambia Bay and upper and lower Escambia Bay. And in these regions, for striped mullet, that's without skin, you can eat 1 meal per week, and that's for all of us, 1 meal per week. Next slide. And then here is all of the species that are listed in all of the water bodies, and you'll notice the next to the last line that's got the red star by it. In Escambia River and tributaries, there's a consumption advisory for PCBs, and Keith Milley's presentation is going to explain for us why that's there. Next slide. So this is back to the seafood, the Florida Department of Health. All this information is there. Next slide. And then also the Florida, the FDA, not Florida, the federal, the FDA has guidance that they are compiling and making available. Next slide. And one of those publications that I found interesting had to do with methylmercury. And mercury, we usually just call it mercury, is probably the constituent of most concern because it's the most abundant out there. And it's naturally occurring through plate tectonic activity. Volcanoes can erupt and send mercury into the atmosphere, but also there are anthropogenic sources. And what happens to that elemental mercury is when it comes down and lands in a place like an estuary and goes to the seafloor, it's acted upon by bacteria. Then it becomes in its methylated form, and that is the form that is the most harmful to us as humans. Next slide. And then also I wanted to go to a non-government site, and this is the Environmental Defense Fund site, and it's where I got my information on my canned tuna. Next slide. And one of the interesting things that they do is they provide consumers with choices where they advise you on these are species that are eco-friendly. And I'll step away from the microphone. So these are eco-friendly species. And here's all of them. There's 86 on this list. 86 that are eco-friendly. That means that their harvesting is done in a way that takes into consideration sustainability and less impact to the environment. So the next category, the eco-friendly and healthy, if you'll click the next slide, there's 5 of these. So that just shows that if you're concerned about your own health as well as the health of the environment, now you've dropped your choices from potentially 86 down to 5. Next slide. And this is just another source from the Natural Resources Defense Council. These show those fish that have various levels of mercury, and they've got some consumption advisories there. Next slide. And then Florida Sea Grant. Rick and his team at University of Florida, the Institute for Food and Agricultural Services or Sciences. Is it services or sciences? Sciences. So their job is to take science information and bring it to us as consumers and citizens. So our next slide. They have various programs that they have on their website, as well as the handouts that Rick brought for us tonight. Next slide. And here is their staff. You'll see Dorothy Lee and Wendy Meredith are part of the team of experts that have subject matter expertise for seafood safety and general food safety. Next slide. And then Rick O'Connor at the top left, he's here tonight. So they have a staff of 18 people that are in Escambia County that it is their mission to help our local citizens and our visitors make wise choices as we live on Earth. Next slide. And our first presenter is Dr. Razia Farzad, and she's actually in Gainesville. I'm going to get my speakers' introductions here. So I'm going to read a quick bio, and then Dr. Farzad is going to give us her overview of the seafood HACCP regulations. Dr. Razia Farzad is an assistant professor at the Food Science and Human Nutrition Department at University of Florida. Before joining University of Florida, Dr. Farzad was a postdoctoral scholar at the Bodega Marine Laboratory of the University of California at Davis, where she worked on developing a non-invasive method using ultrasound technology to evaluate abalone reproduction to assist the recovery effort for endangered black abalone species. She holds a PhD in food science and technology from Virginia Tech. And during her PhD, she worked on developing novel aquafeed to support sustainable seafood production. She also holds a master's degree in biotechnology from Pennsylvania State University. Her areas of expertise include aquaculture nutrition, seafood safety, quality, and cellular agriculture. So I will step down and let Dr. Farzad.
Okay, can you hear me and can you see my slides?
Yes, we can hear you.
I mean, I cannot hear you, so if you put in the chat if you can hear me or see my slides, that would be good. Okay, great. So it's sad that I couldn't hear the room because I assume there were many interesting information about seafood nutrition in general. And although I'm the seafood safety specialist with Florida Sea Grant, I am very interested in other aspects of seafood, such as seafood nutritional values. But my name is Razia Farzad, and I'm an assistant professor and seafood safety extension specialist at University of Florida Food Science and Human Nutrition Department and Florida Sea Grant. Today I'm going to talk about some of the seafood safety regulations that we have in place in the United States to safeguard the production of safe seafood, with the emphasis on seafood HACCP, because most of the seafood in this country are regulated under the FDA HACCP regulation. But before diving into the seafood HACCP regulation, I wanted to emphasize that seafood safety or food safety in general is a multi-layer issue. It involves producers that are aquaculture producers or fishermen or fisherwomen, processors that sometimes producers are processors as well. So at this level, we usually ensure this food safety and seafood safety with the regulation that we have in the place. And then we have market, which is our retail and grocery stores that we have a specific food codes for ensuring seafood safety at market level, and then consumers. So anything that happens from fish to dish can happen the safety or can affect the safety of seafood. And interestingly, many of the things that happen that lead to food safety, seafood safety related disease outbreak usually happens at market and consumers level. So that's why you just showed us all the information that are out there for consumer on how to choose their seafood, what seafood are safe, and there are many other information on how to cook the seafood to make sure that they are safe at the house level, at consumers level. But there are a couple of important regulations initiatives that are in place to ensure that the seafood in this country is safe. The first regulation was Seafood HACCP, which is Seafood Hazard Analysis and Critical Control Points. Any person who is processing fish or fisheries product should comply with this regulation in this country, and I'll talk about Seafood HACCP a little bit more in detail. Then, building on Seafood HACCP, we have Food Safety Modernization Act. That is the same concept using a science-based risk assessment to prevent any hazard to happen and control the hazards that are associated with seafood production and consumption. And the NOAA puts seafood imported monitoring program that is specifically for a species that we are concerned for IUU or illegal, underregulated or unregulated seafood that encompasses more than 1,100 unique species of fish, that they kind of organize them in 13 species of seafood. And basically what is this program is asking to show some transparency from the farm to the table, which take us to the new era of smarter seafood safety of FDA that is built on FSMA, based on the new traceability rule, based on the fact that we are going to use lots of technology. And as I said, all of these are kind of connected to each other, and all of them are important for different to ensuring the safety of different aspects of seafood production. So I'm going to talk a little bit about FSMA as well, because if you are, or if anyone is processing fish or fisheries product, they have to comply with some subpart of FSMA. Although seafood processors are exempt from FSMA, there are some subpart of FSMA that seafood processors should comply with. And then we are going to focus on seafood HACCP. And I should tell that I prepared a 45 minutes presentation, and then I got noticed that it's only 15 minutes. So hopefully there is some coherence and the content makes sense, because I had to delete lots of slides. So Food Safety Modernization Act, FSMA, has a 6 and 7 subparts, which is, the first one is 21 CFR, 117 preventive control for human foods, PC rules that doesn't apply to seafood, but good manufacturing procedures that every food processor in this country should comply with GMP 117. And then we have produce safety that obviously doesn't apply to seafood, foreign supplier verification program, accreditation of third-party audits for foreign facilities, preventive control for animal food. HACCP is only for human food, so any seafood processors that are processing seafood to make pet food, they should comply with preventive controls for animal food. Then we have medication for intentional adulteration, which is relevant to food defense, and sanitary transportation of human and animal food. So the subpart of FSMA that apply to seafood processors are 21 CFR Part 17, Subpart A, that is general provision relevant to training requirements. I'll talk about them a little bit in detail. Subpart B, that is current good manufacturing practices, specifically allergen cross-contact. And we have subpart F, which is record keeping for training records of the seafood producers. And then, as I said, preventive controls for animal food. If any seafood processor is using the byproduct to make pet food, medication for intentional adulteration, and sanitary transportation of human and animal food. If you are, or if the seafood processor is transporting the seafood under a specific condition. FDA has a great document that I can share with you after this presentation, that they are asking question and answer about FSMA and how it's relevant to seafood processors and which subpart is specifically relevant to seafood processors. So let's dive into the seafood HACCP. So the seafood HACCP regulation is Title 21 Code of Federal Regulation 123 for fish and fisheries products. And based on this regulation, FDA put together this training manual called Fish and Fishery Products Hazard and Control Guidance that we usually work on. Part of Seafood HACCP Alliance. I'm working with FDA and Association of Food and Drug Officials. We use this book to teach our seafood processors how to identify any hazard associated with seafood production and how to control them. But let's see what does the regulation say. So based on this regulation, any fish or fishery product processed or imported in violation of the regulation can be considered adulterated and subject to regulatory action. And that regulatory action should be aspects of voluntary recall. So the producer should recall the product out of the market or destroy their product. A processor based on the regulation is any person engaged in commercial, custom, or institutional processing of fish or fishery products, either in the United States or in a foreign country. And an importer is the US owner or consignee, a US agent representative of foreign owner or consignee at the time of product entry into the United States. That being said, we have momentum of understanding with some countries such as Canada. And if we have MOU with countries, some of we don't need to comply with all of the aspects of regulation. I also want to talk about the concepts of primary and secondary processors, because the regulation is specifically asking the processors to comply with regulation. So depending on if someone is a primary processor or secondary processor, they are required to control for specific hazards or not. So primary processor, as is obvious from the name, if a processor is getting the fish or fisheries product from a farm or from fishermen, then they are considered a primary processor. Secondary processors is anyone who is receiving the fish from primary processors. What are the fish or fisheries products based on the regulation? Fish based on regulation are fresh or saltwater finfish, crustacean, mollusks, other forms of aquatic animal life such as alligator, frog, aquatic turtle, jellyfish, sea cucumber, sea urchin, and roe, other than birds or mammal. And fishery product is any food product where fish is a characterizing ingredient. That's where it can get a little tricky. When I teach this class, usually people are familiar with meat and poultry. And when we teach meat and poultry, there are a specific weight of meat and poultry that should be in the product to be considered meat and poultry. We don't have that definition for fish and fishery product. But anything that the characterizing ingredients is fish based on the regulation is considered fishery product, and the product processor should comply with seafood hazard regulation. And also, as I already said multiple times, the regulation apply to only the food that are produced for human consumption. So if you're producing food for animal, that goes under preventive control for animal food under FSMA. Okay, so what does processing include? So processing means handling, storing, preparing, heading, freezing, eviscerating, changing to different market forms, manufacturing, shocking, preserving, packing, labeling, dark stock unloading or holding. So basically anything that you do to the fish after the harvest is considered processing. But that being said, there are some entities that are exempt from regulation. For example, harvesting is exempt from regulation. And that includes aquaculture producers if they are not doing any processing. So if a aquaculture producer is using carbon dioxide or icing or bleeding to slaughter the fish, they don't need any HACCP plan. But as soon as they do any kind of holding and cutting and filleting or any type of processing, then they should have a HACCP plan as well. Transporting doesn't go under HACCP rule, it goes under FSMA's transportation rule. And sometimes the fishing vessels go on long fishing trip and they have to do minimal processing to make sure that the seafood is safe, and that can include heading and eviscerating. Those doesn't go under seafood HACCP either. They don't need to have a HACCP plan, fishing vessels. And also retail operation. Retail operation though, they should comply with food code, which is in place by FDA, and they get updated every 4 or 5 years, and every state adopt that. And also, if at a grocery store, they decide to change the packaging of seafood, and for example, changing it from oxygen permeable to vacuum packed seafood, then they need to have a HACCP plan as well. Okay. So HACCP is not a standalone program. It's built on some prerequisite programs such as sanitation control procedures and good manufacturing procedures. As I said, every food processing facility in this country should comply with GMP 17, but there are some aspects of SCPs and GMPs that a seafood processor should specifically comply with. So, what are sanitation control procedures? Based on the regulation, based on the HACCP regulation, all the seafood processor should monitor the 8 key area of sanitation control procedures and keep the record of monitoring. The regulation doesn't ask for any written SSOPs, sanitation standard operating procedures, but it says that you should monitor it and you should keep the record of it. What are the 8 key areas? Safety of waters, because as we know, there are many water being used in seafood processing facilities, whether it is well water or municipal water, there are different things that you should pay attention to. Condition and cleanliness of food contact surfaces, for pathogen cross-contamination and prevention of cross-contamination, which is different from pathogen the first one, contact surfaces, is for contact surface for allergen, and the second one, cross-contamination for pathogen, which are 2 different things, and maintenance of hand washing, hand sanitizing, and toilet facilities, production of food and food packaging material and food contact surfaces from adulteration, proper labeling, storage and use of toxic compounds, control of employee health condition, and exclusion of pets from food plant. So we have a specific, we have a whole training for sanitation control procedures. This slide is just for overview of the 8 key areas that the seafood processor should monitor and make sure it's in place. So some new aspects of SCPs and GMPs 117 for seafood HACCP. I just kind of mentioned the cleanness of contact surfaces for preventing cross-contact, because finfish, and crustacean shellfish are considered 8 categories of food allergen. So the seafood processor should have a specific sanitation control procedure in place to show how they are making sure that there is no cross-contact, for example, between when they are processing finfish and they are moving to processing crustacean shellfish, or if they are moving from processing fish or crustacean shellfish to something such as dairy and wheat that are considered allergen as well. And there are some additional employee training requirements that must be documented as well. Every person who is working in the seafood facility, they should have a training and understanding of their job. It doesn't need to be an official training. It can be something internal, but they should be trained. They should have understanding of the nature of their job, and the facility should document those training. Also, every single person in seafood processing should have the training of basic of food safety hygiene, things such as how to wash their hand, or should they wear a hairnet or whatnot. But again, these are not some, it can all be internal trainings, but the regulation asks you any training, first of all, have this training. Second of all, you have to keep the record of this training to be in compliance with the regulation. There are 7 principles of HACCP that people should follow when they are developing their HACCP plan to comply with HACCP regulation. So what are those 7 HACCP principles? So the way that we do this, it's very systematically. We are doing risk assessment evaluation to identify the hazards that are associated with our product and process. So the first principle is conducting hazard analysis. The FDA regulation doesn't need a written hazard analysis, although I read in FDAC's website that they mentioned written hazard analysis. So every state has its own regulation. We should pay attention to those state-specific regulations. And after we conduct a hazard analysis, we identify critical control points that are a step in the processing of fish and fisheries product, that if we don't control for the hazard, it's going to lead to seafood related disease outbreak. So that's risk assessment evaluation. Then we move on to risk management control, which is building our HACCP plan, which is principle 3, setting critical limits. What are those maximum and minimum? For example, temperature. Establishing monitoring procedures. How are we monitoring all the steps in our HACCP plan to make sure that our HACCP plan is working? Establishing corrective action procedures. If something goes wrong, how do we make sure that the product that is adulterated is not going to the market, and how do we make sure that it is not going to happen again? Establishing verification procedure, which is the check and balances that any seafood processing facility should have in plan to make sure that the HACCP plan is working. And last but not the least, establishing record keeping system. Whenever I teach the HACCP course, I'm like, if you don't have the record of things that you're doing, it means that you are not doing it. And if someone comes to your facility and you don't have any documentation to show, you are going to be in trouble. Okay, so as I said, based on the regulation, everyone should do hazard analysis based on the 7 principles of HACCP, and then develop a HACCP plan. What are the HACCP plan requirements? First of all, as I said, it should have each 7 principles of HACCP, that each have a section in FDA guide that I just show you, the gold book. And HACCP plan should be specific for each kind of fisheries product. But if a processing plant is using product that have same hazards that can be controlled in the same manner, they can have one HACCP plan. And it should be specific to each processing location. For example, if a Florida producer is producing the exact same thing in Maine, because the environmental situation is different there, they need to have a new HACCP plan there. And also HACCP plan must be dated, signed, dated, and routinely implanted. For record keeping, if anyone is processing fresh product, they need to keep the HACCP plan for 1 year. And for frozen product, they need to keep the record for 2 years. Okay, so as I said, and you heard me multiple times, we are doing all of these things to make sure that any significant hazards that are relevant to seafood safety production, we are controlling them. Usually, the food-related hazards are categorized in biological, chemical, and physical category. So for biological, we have bacteria, viruses, and parasites. For chemical, we have things like allergen. As I said, fish and crustaceans, shellfish, crab, mussel, and shrimp, they are always considered allergen. Pesticides, histamine that can be really an issue if the product gets time and temperature abuse. For specific species of finfish, antibiotic, if you are dealing with aquaculture product, additive, which in the FDA hazard guides, they are called food intolerance substances, which we don't have, we are not using many of them in seafood industry, United States, and marine biotoxins. And then we have physical hazards such as glass, metal, plastic, and wood. And these hazards, the physical hazards, are only considered HACCP hazards if they are part of the packaging. If they are relevant to operational situation, they should be controlled with sanitation program, not by the HACCP program. So after we identified these 3 categories of the hazard, which is a little different for seafood HACCP regulations that I'm going to talk about, how we categorize them using the guide, we are going to use this guide that is basically the guidance from FDA and the current thinking that we should view them as recommendation. And by recommendation, I mean, if we follow this guide, we are gonna comply with seafood HACCP regulation, but it doesn't mean that seafood processor can go outside this guide to control for any hazard that they are identifying for their product, as long as it's science-based and is based on scientific data. So I said that we are categorizing the hazards based on biological, chemical, and physical hazards, but the way that we teach the seafood HACCP course is we say the hazards are there species-related hazards. It's obvious from the name, hazards that are associated with a specific type of fish or shellfish or where they are harvested, or process-related hazards that are hazards associated with different products and product forms and how they are processed, packaged, stored, or distributed. And the guide that I just showed you is very systematically has different tables that show the species and process-related hazards. And for seafood, we are concerned, the species-related hazards that we are concerned is harvest pathogen, for example, for something like Vibrio and oyster, parasites for a specific wild-caught fish, a natural toxin, such as when we have a HABs event and red tide event, histamine, which is the second reason of any seafood safety disease outbreak in United States, for a specific species of fish that are high in histidine, and if they are time and temperature abused, the histidine will convert it to histamine, and even with cooking, we cannot get rid of that. Environmental chemicals, aquaculture drugs, if we are dealing with aquaculture products. And example of process-related hazards are pathogenic bacteria growth due to time and temperature abuse, Clostridium botulinum toxin formation if we are using reduced vacuum packaging for the product, and pathogenic bacterial survival through cooking or pasteurization. Other examples are food additives that I said there are only 3 examples of them that we use in the United States, such as sulfite in shrimp or yellow number 5, and food allergens, metal inclusion, and glass inclusion. So if you are familiar with seafood HACCP regulation and seafood HACCP guide, you know that every single one of these hazards has a chapter in guide that is going to walk you through how to control with them. I just put an example of the table that you can see in the guidebook that I show you. There is a chapter 3 that if you know the Latin and market name of your product, you can go to this list and identify any species-related, process-related hazards, and the vertebrate and invertebrate are categorized separately as well. And based on that, if you know you are primary and secondary processor, you know which hazards is applying to you, and you can use the guide to develop a HACCP plan and control for any hazards that are associated with that specific fish and fisheries product that you are trying to process. So hopefully I didn't talk too fast that I'm even under 15 minutes. But the conclusion is that in US and Florida, seafood HACCP regulation is in place to ensure the safety of commercially available seafood products. We can, if we follow the regulation, there is that beautiful guideline that we don't have it for other type of products. Again, for meat and poultry and juice, we don't have a guideline like that, that we can go and find process and species related hazards. And the common seafood concerns are presence of pathogenic bacteria and its growth. Based on the nature of the seafood, the bacteria and is always there. We can do things to get rid of it by processing, make sure it's not growing and other things. Packaging can be a concern for specifically for Clostridium botulinum toxin type E, and natural toxin that we have many cases of it in, unfortunately, in Florida when red tide happens and we have something brevotoxin. And the issue with those is that we cannot even get rid of them with cooking. And if consumers don't know the source of their seafood and they are not eating commercially seafood, they don't know if the seafood has been sourced properly, that can be problematic. But I know there are other presentations today, so I didn't talk about the National Shellfish Sanitation Program. There are a bunch of other programs that are working hand to hand with HACCP to make sure that our commercial seafood are safe. For my presentation, I just focus on HACCP, but there are additional state and federal regulations that should be followed to comply and keep the seafood safe. So I don't hear you, but I thank you for giving me the opportunity and including me in your seafood symposium. If you have any question, if you type it, I would be more than happy to answer it.
Well, thank you, Dr. Farzad. If you can hear me, great. If not, then we'll make sure we touch base with you and tell you how much we appreciate your work that you've done. Our next presenter is Dr. Allison Robertson. Dr. Robertson is a faculty member in the School of Marine and Environmental
At
Sciences.
that. So
Sciences.
I'll wait for the question.
Okay. She's a graduate coordinator for the master's program in environmental toxicology at University of South Alabama and director of a large Transocean international partnership in ciguatera research and education funded by the U.S. National Science Foundation. Dr. Robertson is also lead investigator in metabolomics and biomarker discovery in the Oceans and Human Health Greater Caribbean Center for Ciguatera Research, led by Florida Gulf Coast University and co-funded by the National Institutes of Health and NSF. Dr. Robertson has been fascinated by organisms that produce toxins and venoms for more than 20 years, working in a variety of different ecosystems all over the world, including Indian Ocean, Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. She has spent the past 14 years working in the northern Gulf of Mexico on seafood safety, specifically on the risk of toxins from harmful algal blooms. Dr. Robertson's research focuses on understanding the biological role and environmental drivers of natural marine toxins in marine microalgae and the mechanisms by which they exert their effects in other marine organisms. The ultimate goal of this work is to develop methods and tools to better predict, manage, and prevent the impacts of harmful algal blooms on population, ecosystem, and community health. Additionally, her research characterizes the spatial, temporal, and food web dynamics of benthic and pelagic harmful algal blooms and how marine organisms and people might adapt and respond at a molecular level, physiological, and behavioral level to low-level environmental exposure to the natural toxins they produce. Over the past decade, Dr. Robertson's major focus has been on ciguatera poisoning, neurotoxic poisoning, red tide, and risks associated with seafood contamination with blue-green algae, which are called cyanobacteria. Dr. Robertson, please take it away, and thank you again for your participation tonight.
Thank you. I could almost hear you, actually. I'm just trying to get my presentation up in a way that makes sense. So just give me a second. Okay, please let me know if you can see this.
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you all for having me. I've been fortunate to actually come and speak with you all in prior years in person. So, but happy to do it also virtually, which helps because I had a class running until 5. But yeah, I thought today we'd talk a little bit about these naturally occurring toxins and what we can do about them and what we're trying to do about them in other places. So I'll dive right in to say this message that I try and give it with every talk that I have, that phytoplankton are actually the good guys. Like, we care about them, we want them to grow, we want them to bloom because they're important for the production of oxygen on the planet, and they're the base of the food web. So without them, we wouldn't have these rich fisheries that we rely on for food. But then there's only 5 to 10% of these phytoplankton that are toxic or capable of doing harmful things. So those are the ones I typically work on, but I'm also interested in those that are on the off side of that. So sometimes we can have a toxic bloom actually be killed off by a really good phytoplankton bloom. So there's good news on both ends of that equation. So of course, the reason why we care about harmful algal blooms and when these phytoplankton can produce toxins is all related to seafood safety. So we can get bioaccumulation of these toxins into filter feeders like the oysters, mussels, and so on. Also, we can have active detrital feeders like our shrimp and crabs and others eating the toxic mass as the bloom dies on the bottom of the seafloor. And then we can get, active food web transfer of these toxins getting up into our apex predatory fish and those important commercial species that we want. And of the harmful algal blooms, I thought I would touch on 3, simply because in this region, we're often often when people ask me about HABs, they're really only talking about red tides, so the Karenia brevis that we see and hear all the horror stories about with massive fish kills and so on. They are important, so I will touch on those. But there are other emerging HABs that we should be paying attention to where regulation is a little bit loose. So we can use some common sense measures in the meantime as various states, regions, and at a federal level come up with guidance to assist with those hazards. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the benthic HABs, and this includes species of phytoplankton such as Gambierdiscus. The species name doesn't really matter, but these are the toxins associated with Ciguatera fish poisoning. Then I'll talk a little bit about the pelagic HABs, so bloom-forming ocean HABs, where you could view these from satellite, and those would include the red tides like Karenia brevis. I'm always cautious to call them red tides though myself, because depending on which region you have a different species forming a red tide, because the red color is associated with many other toxigenic blooms around the country and around the world. Then I'm going to touch really briefly on the cyanobacterial HABs, and I touched on this a little bit last year at the same symposium, but I think it's worth another mention. As we see increased rainfall, we often get blue-green algal blooms that are discharged with fresh water from our river systems, and those can actually do quite well in coastal systems, and the toxins that are produced by those phytoplankton are released into the coastal environment and can get taken up in seafood species as well. So we'll touch on that a little bit. So just to start with benthic HABs, so the benthic HABs actually live on substrates, and they live on the seafloor. So the word benthic really just means that they live near the bottom and they live on a substrate. So in this image with the nice fuzzy greeny brown over here on the left, this is a Dictyota, and this is a common macroalgal species. So fleshier kind of algal species that lives on corals, rocks, debris, and so on. And it's often seen when you have an area that's been overfished, so herbivores or grazers haven't been able to feed on all of that algae. So when you see a degraded reef, you often see a really high abundance of this cover, and this macroalgal cover forms a substrate by which these benthic HABs can live. So this microscopic phytoplankton that need a substrate. So in the right image, you'll see the thallus, or the branches under a microscope of some of those macroalgae. And then these little brown cells all around along the surface are in a layer of mucus that they produce themselves, and they hang on to that thallus, to that macroalgae in their little mucus bed, like a cozy warm blanket that they pull up over themselves, and they just hang on. They are in fact able to swim off this macroalgae into the water column, just like Karenia brevis is also able to swim a little bit, but certainly they're not strong enough to swim against currents, so they're still at the mercy of the water conditions in the ocean. But as you can imagine, for something that prefers to be living on a substrate and hanging on to that substrate with its little mucus layer, any area where you have really high turbulence or really high winds, like the windward site of any island or any location, then you're less likely to have this issue. Whereas if you've got a really sheltered, calm system, and a lot of coral reefs can be described this way as well, then they will thrive and they will do quite well. Thriving does not mean producing toxins though, so that's an important caveat there. The presence of this genus or this group of algae is quite curious, quite interesting. We're actually still trying to understand which ones produce toxins and why. So what the environmental drivers are that help them produce those toxins. And the toxins that they produce are actually massive and very complex. So these are larger, the mitotoxin compound here, which looks like a big caterpillar that loops its way all the way around on my slide. This is one of the largest small molecules known, in fact, and it's just produced by these little brown algae that should be on this video, moving around pretty slowly. But these Gambierdiscus cells produce really high levels of that mitotoxin, and they're also capable of producing ciguatoxins, which have been directly associated with ciguatera poisoning. In the Caribbean region and Western Atlantic, including the Gulf of Mexico, we haven't known what the toxin was that these algae have been producing for really for the last 50 years. But in my group, we were recently able to determine what that was. So there's a new toxin now, which we've called ciguatoxin 5, simply based on its structure. But it's equally as potent as the toxins we find in apex predatory reef fish. And this is something we've hypothesized for a while. So we thought that must be the case, because small, very tiny fish were as toxic as apex predatory fish, such as barracuda, which are often associated with ciguatera, or the one implicated species that people think of. But in fact, these Gambierdiscus are capable of producing lots of different toxins. So the ciguatoxins, another class called gambierones, which are in the center bottom of the slide here, and those really large mitotoxins, all of which are very toxic. Just some are quite water soluble, such as the mitotoxin, and the others are more lipid soluble. When something's more lipid soluble, they can bioaccumulate, so get into an organism. And then they can biomagnify a little bit in the food web, so they can increase in toxicity as different species start feeding on the organisms that they have bioaccumulated in. Somewhat like this, so we have, in this slide, I just wanted to point out that the Gambierdiscus cell, which is actually microscopic, is living on multiple types of substrates. So I talked about the Dictyota in the previous slide, which is the one in the middle circle here. But there are others like Halimeda that you might find for those that are avid snorkelers or scuba divers. Halimeda is a more calcareous macroalgae that you'll see very commonly on reefs. So we've found Gambierdiscus living on it quite happily as well. And then, of course, turf algae, which is the very short, fine and stubby macroalgae that you see on rocks and debris and reefs all over the place. And in looking, working with our fisheries colleagues, we find that fish prefer turf algae. So the finding of Gambierdiscus on turf algae is significant based on their diet. But in all cases, we're trying to understand how different environmental factors might affect the abundance of these cells and the toxin loading of them in a given environment. And then we try and look at how they move through food webs and how they're modified when they move through food webs, so that we can then get a better feel for when an area might be considered toxic or not, and which species might be affected. When it comes down to it, many species are affected when we have toxic algae present. So we have lots of different grazers, and those can be invertebrates and fishes. So a lot of people forget the invertebrates in the equation. So these gastropods and clams and other micrograzers and so on, crustaceans and tiny brine shrimp and other things, those are actually feeding on the macroalgae and detritus as well. So they're capable of being vectors of this toxin. So it can very quickly move through food webs. But what we know is the usual suspects that people think of, certainly through the Caribbean and Western Atlantic, include the barracuda, the king mackerel, amberjacks, and other jack species, various snappers, groupers, and the triggerfish and hogfish in a lot of areas. which queen triggerfish, of course, is more Caribbean, but even the grey triggerfish here we have found occasionally to contain ciguatoxins. Those species are, of course, feeding more on crustaceans and clams and barnacles and other things themselves, and urchins and so on. But all of those lower organisms are feeding on the algae either in the water column or in the benthos. So that's how they end up getting toxic. But the nature of some of these things, and the important part to remember, is that we have lots of species in these food webs, Gambrodiscus living on those algal substrates, and species that are feeding on them have then been eaten by other members in the food web. But what we found is there's actually very little biomagnification. There is some, but it's actually a lot smaller than we would have predicted. So certainly in the same order of magnitude, up to about 9 ppb in the source algae itself, and 5 ppb found in the final fish, like in apex predatory fish, such as the groupers and barracudas in this image. So that's important. We're not dealing with something that acts the same way that mercury does, where we see quite significant biomagnification. So an area that has a high level of ciguatoxins, you might expect that many of the species present there contain, at least basal levels of these toxins. The exception is, of course, planktivores, so fish that are feeding on pelagic phytoplankton only. So things like yellowtail snapper have been an important species to consider. Other species like menhaden and so on, as we get into warm temperate areas, tend not to have these toxins because they're just feeding on something different. So a weak evidence of biomagnification, but certainly we do have to be careful about selection of species and consumption of species in areas that can have been shown to have these toxins. And the current management and guidance for ciguatoxins is largely not, well, there is none really. I mean, the major guidance in the FDA guide that was mentioned in the previous talk is really to avoid species that are known to accumulate ciguatoxins from regions that are considered to have a high prevalence of ciguatera. And that's the main guidance. So if fishermen know that they are fishing in an area where ciguatera occurs and collecting species that have been reported to have ciguatoxins before, then that needs to be recorded and reported and so on, and is considered a risk. However, if species are being collected, let's say barracuda or king mackerel, which people do eat but don't necessarily love to eat, up here in the northern Gulf of Mexico, they might be collected and eaten, but this would be considered a lower risk region for ciguatera poisoning. Having said that, in recent years, we've been following for the last 10 years the change in prevalence of ciguatoxins in predatory reef fish collected during our Alabama deep sea fishing rodeos and so on. And we've gone from seeing like about a 2% incidence of ciguatoxin, detectable ciguatoxin in fishes such as red snapper, barracuda, and the king mackerel and Spanish mackerel. And that's now reaching up to 10 and 11% in the mackerels. So it's something that we do need to keep an eye out, and it is emerging in this region. We've also seen outbreaks, so poisoning outbreaks from folks from the local region, both in Gulfport, Pensacola, and related areas where they have had amberjack and other grouper species at a restaurant and become sick. So two things to consider there is where, in traceback analysis, where have the fish come from and been caught? And if that's local, it helps for us to know that. so that collectively with fishermen, fisheries processors, restaurateurs, and all the other stakeholders, we can make a plan to avoid that, because nobody wants to get anybody sick. So as we get more data, we hope to share that with the public as well. Unfortunately, for these kinds of toxins, cooking and freezing has no effect. You can't rinse the toxin from the flesh. And there's no current guidance for shellfish, although shellfish could be implicated, such as conch or scallops, for instance, and other crustaceans could be an important vector here. Of course, I'm not trying to set the panic button here. It's not necessary in this region, but we do have a lot of people in Florida that also do sport fishing in the Bahamas and related areas that have a very high prevalence of ciguatoxins and ciguatera. So that's an important aspect. We also have a lot of import and export of seafood, right? And this has become a really important area to consider, because there is no pre-surveillance testing for any seafood for these toxins. And there have been large outbreaks in Brooklyn, New York, in the United Kingdom, Germany, and other places from seafood that has been collected either in the Caribbean, Western Atlantic in general, Indian Ocean, and Pacific. So knowing where our seafood comes from is, of course, always important, as you all know. There are safety levels and regulations that have been set by FDA and EPA, and this is also found in that HACCP guide that was mentioned previously. However, that's a really difficult thing to do for ciguatoxins. These are complex toxins. And at the moment, we don't have a rapid test that could be used dockside or in a processing plant or otherwise outsourced to a lab, because you have to have some fairly advanced instrumentation available. But we do, of course, have that, and we're working with governments all over the world to try and develop testing strategies and protocols. But at this stage, it's not going to be at the speed and cost that is needed for appropriate seafood surveillance for prevention of illness. But I'm happy to answer any questions on that, but I'm going to move on to save some time here, because I'm sure you all want to get home sometime. So red tide here in the northern Gulf of Mexico has been associated with Karenia. There are actually multiple species of Karenia when we do have a bloom. In this region, we often get Karenia brevis and Karenia mikomoitoi. They can either bloom on their own or they can bloom together, and they can bloom with other species. But they have this characteristic shape. They're really easy to identify under a microscope, and they're also very obvious from satellites because they have a really strong, I have actually stained them in these microscopy slides that are viewed on the slide here. But typically we can see them with a they're really red pigmented from satellites. Having said that, they don't look blood red in the water, and they can often be missed in areas where we have river-dominated systems. Certainly over where I am in Mobile Bay, that's a problem. So we can often mistake a bloom for murky water that we have here. An important point here is to say that the National Shellfish Sanitation Plan sets a harvest threshold for Karenia at 5,000 cells per litre. And routine monitoring that's done at a state level is conducted to make sure that at least on a monthly basis, cells aren't reaching this level. When they are, the shellfish harvest areas are closed, and any product that has gone to market is either held or quarantined until further testing. But what does that level mean? So 5,000 cells per litre, it's actually really low. That's a really, really low level. So, but on a per cell basis, each microscopic cell could produce up to about 35 picograms, which is a minuscule amount, but per cell. So it would take about 500,000 cells per liter and to get to a level that would reach the tipping point of the guidance level for toxicity. And that would take about a week to exceed guidance. So there's a 100-fold safety factor involved here, and that's been very effective in making sure that there have been very few illnesses happening. In fact, I think to date in the US, there have been no cases that I have heard of, at least recently, of neurotoxic shellfish poisoning, which would result from the toxins produced by Karenia getting into shellfish. What we do see, though, is the respiratory irritation that comes with those blooms for those that have been around them. Certainly, I have felt that as somebody who goes and samples in them. But in our region, it might look more like this. And where I am and on Dolphin Island, looking out from my office window, it would often look like this. So I would certainly not be able to tell if a bloom was happening just by looking in the surf zone, because we often have quite brown water. In Pointer Pines, in one of our blooms, I just wanted to show the progression of a bloom here. We saw a bloom start on November 25th. And the dashed line, which you can barely see, is actually the cells per liter. So that's following along on the left y-axis here. So cells per liter, barely detectable, but then we just get a spike of them around December 9th. And then it goes all the way back down again. But you'll see that in that time, that spike was up to 100,000 cells. But the green bars here are the brevitoxin equivalents that were found in oysters. So you'll see there's a toxin load in the water column. And even though the bloom has gone away, the shellfish continue to bioaccumulate toxins for quite a long period of time. And then they slowly clear those toxins again through their systems. The guidance level is right here around 800 parts per billion, or 0.8 parts per million. And you'll see at this just one point, we just got over that guidance level and that area, but that area was closed for this entire period from the point of, December 9th onward. So you'll see that with that trigger level in place, although the cells weren't there for very long, it was protective because these higher levels of toxin in those shellfish lasted for quite a while. What I will say is what we don't know is what the longer term effects would be of consumption of shellfish that might have levels below the guidance limit for safe consumption. But if you were continuing to eat, once a week or twice a week of shellfish that had lower levels, that date, we don't know the answer to that. So that's important to consider. But these blooms can look like this, like multiple cells of Karenia brevis here, but often they look like this, where we have multiple species of dinoflagellates present. In the lower left here, we have Dinophysis. This produces toxins of its own that are very important to us. They're associated with diuretic shellfish poisoning. In the center, I have Karenia brevis here next to Prorocentrum micans, and this is another species that produces diuretic shellfish toxins. And then in the top right, there's a smaller cell between two Karenia. That's actually Carlidinium, which we find in more brackish water, but it's a very small cell and produces carlitoxins, which are ichthyotoxic. So there's no known effect on humans, but they would be associated with fish kills. They often bloom in 9 million cells per liter, so really, really high density compared to a Karenia brevis bloom. So it's often a little challenging to determine if a fish kill is being produced by Carlidinium or Karenia in those cases. But current management and guidance, harvest areas are closed based on that trigger level that I mentioned. And at that point, shellfish are retained, recalled. until multiple shellfish tests can come back below the guidance levels. And you need back-to-back tests to come back below that guidance for an area to be reopened. But there's no current guidance for fish, though fish have been shown to be not only affected by the toxins behaviorally, but also to bioaccumulate them. And in some cases, during fish kills, where you have the beaches of Pensacola, Navarre, Fort Walton, and Destin covered in fish that have been killed by being exposed to these toxins. But a lot of people have been found picking them up and taking them home, thinking it's more like a Jubilee situation. So that's something that, of course, we don't recommend, certainly not during these kinds of events. The brevetoxin illness or poisoning syndrome is called neurotoxic shellfish poisoning. And as I mentioned, that's the guidance levels set by FDA and EPA are in the 0.8 milligram per kilogram range, which is 0.8 ppb. So the last thing I was going to touch on really briefly was the cyanohabs. So cyanobacteria are blue-green algae, and when we talk about cyanohabs, we're typically talking about freshwater systems that are affected. But around the United States, including the Northern Gulf of Mexico, we've been seeing increased flushing events with high rainwater. You know, we get a lot more rainfall in this region. That comes with flushing of freshwater systems into the coastal area. And in an area where we already have fairly low salinity compared to other places, that can be a problem. So these freshwater cyanobacteria can actually survive up to about 20 parts per thousand saline. So they do quite well for quite a while, to the point where they start to die, but that breaks their cells open and allows them to release the toxins into the water column. So of course that's a problem as well, a little bit. So these cyanohabs, the biggest problem we have with them is the production of a toxin called microcystin. There are actually 90 variants of those toxins, and they pose a serious problem to human health if they contaminate drinking water and food. In a freshwater system, we would be worried about drinking water. So much of the regulation has been focused on EPA regulation around potable water supplies and recreational water in freshwater zones. But these have been responsible for human fatalities in dialysis clinics that have had really poor water filtration systems and so on, and widespread poisoning of wild and domestic animals. When we see this in coastal systems, it can be associated with dog poisonings and other dermal itching and other problems of people that are swimming in this water. But obviously, if you see pea soup colored water in the coast, just don't get in there and don't go fishing there. That's the best advice we can give for that. But widespread intoxications of aquatic organisms happen, but very few documents have come through on what happens in coastal systems. So we set, during this event in 2019, we had really widespread hundreds of kilometers of coastline blooming with these blue-green algae. So we took that opportunity to analyze seafood and see what happened. But they are quite beautiful to look at. You'll see these nice ring-forming, bracelet-looking cyanobacterial cell chains. They're actually pretty cool, but of course we don't want them in our seafood. But the toxins we found, we looked in shrimp, mullet, croaker, flounder, black drum, and red drum, were all certainly detectable levels and above the drinking water limit for, which is a recommended level of 1 ppb. So we have microcystin, total microcystin level here on the y-axis of this bar chart, and you'll see obviously the shrimp, mullet, and croaker were quite a bit higher than that. And then we looked, I don't know why. Sorry about that. I seem to be missing part of this slide, but we did look in blue crab. So I had a figure of blue crab here, just showing actually really high levels. So in blue crab, we saw levels up to 35 and 40 parts per billion. And this is certainly reaching a level that would be of concern for human health. The microcystin toxins are hepatotoxins, so they affect the liver and through multiple mechanisms, but in chronic doses, they are thought to be tumor promoters or have been shown to be tumor promoters, and at an acute level can cause hemorrhaging of the liver and other related effects. So certainly not something we want in our seafood. But in crab, in the blue crab, we think we saw the higher levels, just like with the croaker, because they're feeding in the detrital zone as these blooms were breaking apart, reaching the salt water. All of that material is sinking to the bottom. And then really that's just food for these organisms. So I would have expected higher levels in flounder, but they seem to move out of the area. Whereas croaker and the blue crab didn't really get away too much. So what about provisional guidance? We only have provisional guidance and through the World Health Organization. The lifetime in the freshwater environment, we have 3 official guidances that are WHO approved and with the EPA. So the lifetime drinking water guidance value, this is GV, for microcystin LR, this is the most toxic variant of the microcystins that we know of, and one that is more lipophilic, meaning or more fat soluble, so able to move into organisms. So the lifetime drinking water limit there is 1 microgram per liter that could be consumed without significant negative effects. The short-term drinking water guidance limit for the same toxin is about 12 micrograms per liter, or at the ppb level, 12 ppb. And then in short-term recreational water, so this is swimming and being exposed through various recreational activities, but not drinking, that level is 24 micrograms per liter. But there's actually no current federal guidance for seafood, and certainly from marine areas. So there's only suggested guidance levels for seafood in this case, which is, depending on the state that has been affected, it's between 1 and 24 micrograms per kilogram. But those levels don't mean anything if we don't have testing in place to determine if they're present. So at the moment, most local guidance is that during these blooms, where there are visible slicks of cyanobacteria in the coastal zone, that fishing and shellfish harvest should be avoided. But that's just common sense. And once that bloom has subsided, we still don't have the data to know how long somebody should wait or harvesters should wait to have safe seafood again. So all data that we need to get, and there's a significant priority in the field to try and obtain that data as soon as possible, because we're not alone. This is happening here. We expect to see similar blooms happening this summer. So we need to get enough data so that we can help local, regional, and federal managers come up with appropriate guidance for consumers, fishers, and processors, and so on. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Our next speaker is Michelle Smith. She's here from the Florida Division of Aquaculture and the Department of Agriculture. Michelle has been employed with the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services since 2015 and is currently the Environmental Administrator, the Program Lead for the Shellfish Harvesting Area Classification Program within the Division of Aquaculture. So we'll pull your presentation up. Michelle, thank you for being here. And we look forward to hearing how you are helping us manage our seafood. As we've heard from the previous presenters, there is a substantial number of things that could harm us, and you are the one of the safety nets between us and some of these intoxications. Thank you. Yes, please. There you go.
Okay. All right. Can y'all hear me all right? Yeah? Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I work for the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services in the Shellfish Harvesting Area Classification Program. And we monitor and classify shellfish harvesting areas so oysters and clams are safe to eat. Next slide, please. So our management goals with this program, the number one goal is to protect consumers from shellfish-borne illnesses. And we also want to maximize the acreage allowed for the harvest of shellfish while minimizing the number of days closed to harvest. And we achieve those goals by following the guidelines set forth by the FDA and the National Shellfish Sanitation Program. Next slide.
Sorry, whenever something pops up, it wants to.
So the National Shellfish Sanitation Program, as was mentioned earlier, is a program that sets these requirements that we have to follow to regulate interstate commerce of shellfish. And this is all in the NSSP model ordinance. And so this protects public health by ensuring the harvest of shellfish is from properly classified waters and that they're handled properly at all levels from harvest to final sell. The U.S. FDA oversees and ensures compliance by all member states through annual audits. We're actually going through audits right now for our harvesting areas. They send a regional shellfish specialist out, and they go and drive around in the boats with us and make sure our areas are classified as they should be. Next slide. So one of our main components that we do is the Comprehensive Shellfish Harvesting Area Survey, and this has three components: the pollution source survey, water sampling, and data analysis to help determine classification and management plans. Next slide. So the pollution source survey identifies all potential pollution sources in an area. And this includes marinas, wastewater treatment plants, septic tanks, runoff, farms, any pollution source that you can think of that is in our study area that could affect the bay system, the shellfish harvesting area, we document and identify. Next slide. And then we have fixed stations throughout an area that we sample. And these stations are put throughout the area to monitor pollution sources. And we also collect temperature, salinity, dissolved oxygen, and pH. And we try to get, once an area is classified, we sample at least once a month to continually monitor the area. And you can see these are the stations that we have right now for the Pensacola Bay system. Next slide. So then our samples are sent to our lab in Apalachicola, and they are analyzed for fecal coliform bacteria. That's what we use as our indicator species. And so when fecal coliform is present, other human pathogens may also be present. And they run the water samples through these filters, and they count the little colonies that form. Next slide. And so besides just water sample collection, we also monitor and record rainfall and river levels daily. And we get this from various sources, the Florida Forest Service, the USGS, we get the river levels from, state parks, that kind of stuff. And we use statistical analysis to assess correlations between fecal coliform and those rainfall and river levels. And that allows us to create these classification areas and the management plan closure criteria. We close predictively based on what the statistics tells us. Next slide. So these are our types of classifications. We have approved areas which are not near pollution sources, and they meet the NSSP standards even during what we call adverse pollution conditions. And they are safe to harvest from pretty much all the time. The only time they close is during emergencies, hurricanes, harmful algal blooms, wastewater releases. And then we have conditionally approved areas, which is by far our most common classification type. And it's conditional on environmental factors. So it's open a lot of the time, but then it closes when there's a predicted increase in fecal coliform. And then we also close those areas on hurricanes and other emergency closures. Next slide. Then we also have restricted and conditionally restricted areas, and they do not meet the approved or conditionally approved water quality standards. And those are only for areas that you can't harvest directly from the area. You have to take a shellfish from the area and put it in a conditionally approved or approved area or a deprivation facility. Florida no longer allows relaying, mainly because of the pressure on the resource, and no deprivation facilities exist. So we treat restricted and conditionally restricted areas as prohibited. They are closed to harvest all the time. And we are in the process of reclassifying those areas. Sometimes they can be reclassified as conditionally approved, just depends on water quality. Most of them are being turned into prohibited. And so our prohibited areas are closed all the time because the water quality is too degraded for shellfish to be eaten safely. Next slide. So this is our plan, our classification and our plans for the Pensacola Bay system. And we actually just created this plan. We resurveyed the Pensacola Bay area last year. And so we have only conditionally approved and prohibited here. And Escambia Bay is a 5-day rainfall of 3.35 inches or greater, or the Escambia River discharge reaches 15,456 cubic feet per second. And East Bay is a 5-day rainfall of 3.8 inches or greater, and the Yellow River stage reaches 40.54 feet. And we get our rainfall for these areas from NOAA. They provide that data for us. Next slide. So once an area is classified and we have these management plans, we can manage daily the area. And so we monitor and collect the rainfall and river levels every day. And once that is exceeded, we close the area to harvest. And we also close, as I said, on emergency conditions or harmful algal blooms. As it was mentioned earlier, Carina brevis, if the cell counts in our water samples, which are separate water samples that we send to the FWC, FWRI lab down in St. Pete, if they reach 5,000 cells per liter, we close the area to harvest. Next slide. And to reopen an area, we try to get out there as quickly as possible to get the area reopened and collect water samples. And so we have to have passing water samples and improving environmental conditions. Sometimes we have to get meat samples after hurricanes because you have wastewater releases and flooded septic tanks and just, a ton of rain. So that usually we just get meat samples after hurricanes. And then if you have a red tide or any other harmful algal bloom, we have to get water and meat samples as well. And those are sent down to the FWRI lab in St. Pete. Next slide. So how do we determine these plans work and keep y'all safe? So we have to sample the areas at least 5 times a year under adverse pollution conditions. And what that means is when it rains or the river levels are elevated, we suspect that fecal coliform levels will be elevated. But because it didn't exceed, the fecal coliform levels should not be above the standard. And so we go and sample and make sure that it's still meeting when it says it should be meeting. And we review our plans every year, and then we reevaluate all the pollution sources and everything every 3 years, and then do a complete survey every 12 years at a minimum. We shoot for every 9 years in our program. Next slide. And this is our biotoxin management plan. We actively monitor for 3, Carina brevis, Pyrodinium, Bahaments, and Pseudonychia species So you have the neurotoxin shellfish poisoning, paralytic shellfish poisoning, and amnesiac shellfish poisoning. And so these are just the levels we close them at and how we can reopen them. And we have to do the mouse bioassay, or ELISA, which is a PCR test that they can just run a lot quicker than the mouse bioassay, and no mice have to die. Next slide. And this is our website, and you can go on there and find information. You can see we have, each area has its own information there, and you can get maps, and all our water quality data is now available online, and most of the areas go back to the 80s, so we have a ton of data. We also have an interactive shellfish map now, a GIS map, and that will have the classification on there and also the stations, so you can see where the stations are located. And we have district offices. We have 5 district offices. So the one that covers this area from Escambia County to Bay County is the Western Gulf Coast, and that's their phone number. They're located in Panama City. We have 2 environmental specialists over there, so they're the ones that go out here and sample the water. Next slide. And these are the other programs in the Division of Aquaculture, and we all work together to make sure everything is safe for y'all to eat. The big one is the Shellfish Processing Facility Certification. They're the ones going and inspecting all the processing plants and everything, checking their HACCP plans, that kind of stuff. So you can go to the website and read more information about those programs. Next slide. And that's it.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Dr. Lisa Wadner. She's an assistant professor at University of West Florida. She has a PhD from the College of Marine Science at the University of Delaware. Before she joined UWF in 2016, she had the unique opportunity to work in several small biotechnology companies in the capacity of genetic engineering, phylogenetics, and directed evolution to improve biofuel and bioenergy producing microorganisms. Her academic mentors were Dr. Richard Karpold and David Kirchman and Thomas Hansen, and co-mentors Robin Morgan and Joan Burnside. Her findings have been published in the Journal of Shellfish Research, Applied in Environmental Microbiology, Virology. Environmental virology. Topics have included aspects of Marek's disease, Virioplankton populations, and crab populations near the mouth of the Delaware Bay. Her current research interests are in environmental microbiology, microbial ecology, bioremediation in oceans, coastal waters, inland bays, and rivers. These studies include developing a better understanding of the global elemental cycles, as well as applied bioremediation research. Her work uses model bacteria called aerobic and oxygenic phototrophs, AAPs for short, for good reason. They're a diverse group of proteobacteria that may be involved in light-stimulated uptake of dissolved organic matter and point source pollution and legacy contaminants. Cultured and uncultured AAPs are used in molecular, biological, microbiological, and ecological studies on this diverse group of freshwater, estuarine, and marine bacteria. Dr. Wadner has taught classes in Introduction to Bioinformatics and Environmental Genomics and is currently a UWF instructor for Genetics Lab. She is now working with undergraduate students to characterize unique AAP bacteria from coastal and inland waters in and around the Pensacola Bay system. And she was part of the research team that received funding from Escambia County to look at the Vibrio species in the Pensacola Bay system. So thank you for being here, and we appreciate you giving us an introduction to Vibrio.
I should have given him a shorter bio. Do you mind if I not look at you guys? I didn't think these people would be here. I thought you people would be here. So I wrote the talk for you guys. So Dr. Jeffrey is right there. Next slide, please. I'm going to go real fast. It's a lot of slides. So Dr. Jeffrey is the director of CDB. Dr. Jane Caffrey, she's not here. She was the other worker on this Vibrio project that we did early 2020. Next slide, please. So I put this slide in here to kind of craft my talk for you all. So I'm going to talk a little bit about handling and storage. I don't know the rules. I don't know the laws. I just do the science. Preparation, I'm going to talk about that, and Vibrio, of course. Natural sources is where all of these guys come from. Next slide, please. Okay. So, yes. All right. So, anyone heard about this rule? Do you follow this rule? Anyone?
Yes.
Arm,
heard
right. Okay. Well, when I was younger, I used to be stupid and do a lot of stupid things like drive really fast in the rain, and then I smashed up my arm. So I don't do that anymore. And I don't eat raw oysters anymore just because I know the numbers that are in these oysters. So I will eat cooked oysters now. So the simple rule is just cook the oysters and you'll be good. Unlike all those toxins that the previous lady was talking about, there is a solution for Vibrio, and it is cook the oysters. Next slide, please. So this slide tells you, and I'll provide anyone who wants this presentation, but this slide tells you there are several sources that say this is not true, especially here in Escambia County, and I'll show you a little bit of the data. Next slide, please. So vibriosis is just a general term for you can get a cut and then you get infected with Vibrio vulnificus and then it blows up. And I heard Kendall's story, and maybe she'll share her story with us. But if you do get a cut and you have you think you have an infection that you got from either shellfish or fish or cleaning up after a hurricane, don't ignore it. Deal with it right away. You can get cured right away. The other vibriosis is just the upset stomach, which can lead in vulnerable individuals to extreme sickness and possibly death if you don't deal with it right away. And that's usually associated with Vibrio perihemolyticus, which I'm just going to call VP. Next slide, please. So you can read all this, but infection symptoms can include chills, fever, all the typical things you would think that you would get from an infection. And of course, some people are at greater risk than others. So like I said, when I was younger, I was invulnerable. Now I'm older, and so I look out for caution signs like this. Next slide, please. So staying safe. So these are general recommendations that I pulled from a bunch of different places, including Escambia County's website. This is CDC, and it just says boiling for 3 minutes, frying in oil for 3 minutes, broiling for 3 inches from the heat for 3 minutes, or baking for 10 minutes. Uh-oh. That's it. Last call. That's okay. Next slide, please. This is from the Florida Department of Health, specifically for Escambia County. And it just is one story from last summer regarding a death. Next slide, please. So, you will hear about these deaths. You will hear about people who possibly harvested on their own and left it around at room temperature for a couple of hours and then ate the oysters raw. Again, young and foolish. Maybe older people are a little bit more wise. But often you can get away with getting a cut, getting infected with Vibrio, and not have any symptoms or just kind of mild symptoms. More often you can get away with eating oysters that have perihemolyticus in them, and you may get an upset stomach. But again, certain individuals will be way more vulnerable than others. Next slide, please. So myths I've heard of: drinking alcohol with it, putting lime juice, lemon juice, hot sauce, all of the above, putting the lime juice in your tequila, all of those things do not work. So the only thing that does kill Vibrio in your oyster is to cook it. Next slide, please. So this is another comment from that previous page says, you know, you got to cook the oyster. Vibrio vulnificus bacteria, as well as the other one that I'm going to talk about in a second, they're saying it's not a result of pollution. Well, what is pollution, right? So we looked a lot at what different pollution levels are in the various waters around Escambia County. And so some are more polluted than others, just depending on what your definition of pollution is, right? But that's generally true. The levels of Vibrio that you're going to see in different body waters that we saw in the winter when it was cold has nothing to do with any one particular pollutant, if you will. Next slide, please. So just to understand what Vibrio is, you heard about the big guys, the pretty pictures of the cyanobacteria and all that. Vibrio are just bacteria. They're not a virus. Sometimes you'll hear like media people call them viruses because Vibrio sounds kind of like virus. Okay, it's a virus. But a virus is way, way smaller. So like a human is to a hot dog what a bacterium is to a virus, relative size-wise, right? So bacteria are huge compared to viruses. What the scary paralytic shellfish poisoning organisms do, they're like the next one up. They're like the size of a blue whale compared to us. So there is, everything seems small to, you know, everyone who's not looking in the microscope, but there's a huge continuum in sizes. Next slide, please. This is an interesting fact put in a book by my advisor, which is that there are more murders among humans than there are pathogens among microbes. So like the other lady said, the vast majority of microbes or bacteria are not harmful. And in fact, we, all of us healthy people, have more bacterial cells in and on our bodies than our own cells. So you're just a bag of microbes. Next slide, please. So the good and the bad and the ugly, right? People hear of Vibrio and they think it's bad, but there is one example of a really cool Vibrio that's not bad to anybody. Next slide, please. And that's, if you've heard of these kinds of bobtail squids, they live like in Hawaiian waters and other tropical waters, and they have symbiotic Vibrio that live on them. They actually glow. They're called Vibrio fischeri, and they help this bobtail squid escape sharks at night, but it also helps them find food at night. But the bad ones is why I'm here to talk. Next slide, please. So bad ones include like the vulnificus, that's the flesh-eating disease, if you will, or the parahemolyticus, the VP, which is the one you often associate with eating contaminated oysters. Next slide, please. So unfortunately, it's really hard to do this work, as you surmise from the other previous people's talks, but using a microscope ain't going to do you any good. They all kind of look the same. Vibrio on the left and Vibrio on the right, actually Vibrio kind of means comma. So the left ones are great and they're not harmful or pathogenic to anybody, and the ones on the right are the ones that cause cholera, which I'm not going to talk about today. Next slide, please. So you need to use some kind of other tricks or methods. We use, for the purposes of this study that Dr. Jeffrey and Dr. Caffrey and I did together, we used mostly the classic microbiology method, but we also kind of backed it up with a little bit of molecular biology methods. And my current graduate student is taking this project to the next level and looking all molecular. Next slide, please. So this is primarily the method that we used to do the study for Escambia County, which started in February 2020 and ended in March 2020. There's kind of proprietary methods that you can either make this on your own, or it's actually just a lot easier to buy it. And we had stacks of plates. He actually got pretty mad at me because I had I had stacks of plates filling up his whole beer cooler for months just to make sure that I had all the data. So next slide, please. So these are actually our plates, and so the one, this doesn't work on this screen for some reason, but the one, the bottom right, that's all a bunch of purple colonies, that was one example from our worst station in all 44 stations, and that was in Bayou Tehar. That's not to say Bayou Tehar is polluted or more polluted than others, and you'll see why in a second. Next slide, please. We also backed it up with molecular data. So just suffice it to say that we used specific PCR primers known for specific DNA sequences to be associated with these particular types of Vibrio, this one or that one. Next slide, please. So here's an example from a while ago, and this is actually what kind of got us prompted to get into the Escambia County study. But even before that, I had a student who was interested in looking in Santa Rosa County. Next slide, please. Yeah, keep going. Sorry. And he was interested in Santa Rosa County stations, like the one lady who was here before. She was talking about they regularly look at water samples throughout various stations in the county. Well, he looked at Enterococcus levels, and there's health advisory status you can look at on the Escambia County website, and they'll tell you, okay, we measure every month, and you see high levels or low levels or moderate levels or caution levels or whatever. But Enterococcus, so when you hear like the beach is closed because of high bacterial levels, well, yeah, that's bad. That's a bad thing. And that's why, rightly, that one lady who was talking before, we shut it down and we don't allow harvesting. But Enterococcus has nothing to do with Vibrio. And the waters where Enterococcus is really, really high doesn't necessarily mean that Vibrio is going to be high. Next slide, please. So these are the two stars of the show, and as I mentioned, vulnificus is typically the one you associate with the flesh-eating disease, and parahemolyticus is the one that gives you the gastroenteritis, the upset stomach, and in vulnerable individuals, if you leave it unchecked, can lead to serious illness and disease. Next slide, please. So here are a couple of examples. I only have them up to 2019, but these are from the Florida Department of Health. So, and it does tell you per county, but those have limitations. Those dates have limitations as well, because, for instance, there was one case study. Who knows, anyone know someone who had Vibrio, had to get treated for it? Couple people. So I've met several through the years, and one is the daughter of a man who died, but he was visiting from Tennessee. So he was here, he was splashing around the Gulf, had a great time. By the time they got home, he was close to terminal. So, but he was marked as a death outside of Escambia County, right? Because he didn't go to the ER here, he went to the ER there. So these numbers are somewhat underestimates. Next slide, please. CDC also posts these data. So if you're more interested in kind of regional trends or just overall national trends, check out the CDC CODIS website, which also includes cholera cases as well as the other two that I'm talking about. Next slide, please. So again, what does this pollution mean, right? So there's a lot of different definitions for pollution. And what is a healthy water body? Is it murky and kind of scary looking like that one lady showed us with her scary looking waves? Not necessarily. So what we did was, with the help of Escambia County, measured a whole bunch of things at a whole bunch of different locations to figure out where these would be predicted to be high in the worst case scenarios. Next slide, please. Our first talks started way before we brought in Escambia County. We were dealing with Don McMahon, who was the owner of Pensacola Bay Oyster Company, and also Barbara Albrecht, who is the president of the BFA. Next slide, please. And we wanted to know, what are these dangerous levels, right? So this is a relatively recent paper that talks about how many cells of Vibrio per gram of oyster can you consume before it's dangerous to a normal, healthy, somewhat younger individual than myself, right? Next slide, please. And then also I got kind of word of mouth personal communication from Dr. Lanza. Anyone remember him? He just retired, like pretty much COVID came and he was like, I'm out. But he is? Oh, okay. Oh, cool. So, but he gave me an estimate of 30 cells per milliliter, which is consistent with the 30 cells per gram of oysters, right? So if we stick with that 30 number, kind of keep that in our head, we'll know where we are as far as above or below that healthy or dangerous threshold. Next slide, please. And that's kind of backed up with what this medical doctor in a recent review, I don't know the date of it, says. But again, what's dangerous for a normal person is 30 or above. It actually may be much worse. So maybe it's 5 or above if you have diabetes, right? Or if you have a combination of diabetes and kidney disease, right? So it's just a matter of keeping track of how many risk factors you have and how much you want to roll the dice in eating those raw oysters. Next slide, please. That's also kind of backed up with a very, very solid review article from Baker Austin, and they're also associated with the same review article we looked at before. And so we're looking at 1,000 to 10,000 cells that you'd have to ingest before you'd be in that danger zone, right? So we have to think about that level of danger versus not. Next slide, please. So prior to the Escambia County study, I did a little bit of study, as I mentioned, with a student in Santa Rosa County, and I'll show you that in a second. But the big study is the 44 sites in 7 different water bodies around here. Next. This is the first study, so this goes back, and that's Indian Bayou in Santa Rosa County, just on the other side of the bridge. Next. And he and the helpers in the lab looked at molecular methods to detect any samples in Santa Rosa, in the Indian Bayou, any time of the year, using those those 4 genes. And next, and he sampled, sorry, it was 2018 to 19, and in all of those samples, 4 stations, 20 dates, and he looked for the vulnificus one and the other 3. Next. He got really nice standard curves, so there was nothing wrong methodologically. But next, it was all negative. Every single sample in Indian Bayou in 4 different stations, close to the Escambia Bay, all the way up at the freshwater end, they were all negative. So, but we did get a lot of numbers from the Escambia County project. Next, please. So this is when we did the study, February to March of 2020, in those 7 bodies of water, which are indicated with all those pins. So basically Pensacola Bay, Escambia Bay, all one giant body of water, but they are kind of separated. A couple of urban bayous, as well as Bayou Grande, Big Lagoon, and Perdido Bay, but we stayed on our side of the line, the Alabama-Florida line. And Bayou Grande also included Navy Point, which is an area where there's a lot of oyster beds, right, where people recreate. Next, please. Standard stuff, swabbing where we could, right? So we didn't collect oysters. When we could see an oyster from the boat, we swabbed it, and that was the end of it. The vast majority of our numbers are from water samples collected with a bucket or sediment samples from a Ponar grab from a boat. Next, please. And then we did all of these other measurements, which you don't want to hear about. But basically, we covered our bases as far as like determining what pollution is and what the relative levels of pollutions of these different bodies of water were, and then try to make correlations to give you some kind of predictive tool for baseline in the winter, right? So February to March is not the coldest of the cold months, but it was still, the water was fairly cold except for the last couple of sample dates. Next, please. So just a couple fun pictures from the boat, Escambia Bay, Lower Pensacola Bay, Bayou Tejar, and Santa Rosa Sound, where we had a couple of barnacle samples. That was nice. Chico, and there's all the sites, including Navy Point. Someone's very sorry they have to head home. Okay, so we looked at all these kind of pollution measurements, nutrient levels, turbidity of the water, measuring by like light, but also just by measuring how much sediment. If you filter a lot of water, how much sediment do you collect on a filter, right? But also we looked at, from the airport, it's free data, how much wind had been pushed through the area on the 1 day prior, 2 days prior, 3 days prior, and also precipitation before. Because the hypothesis is the more wind and rain you have introduced into the system right before you sample, the more the sediments are going to get kicked up, and you're going to find the Vibrio in the water column, which is where we're playing around, right? So next slide, please. We had a wide range of surface water salinities and temperatures during that 1 month time frame. So we really spread out and gave ourselves a lot of opportunity to find healthy water and not so healthy water. Okay, next. So, you know, you don't need to know all of this stuff, but basically of the 44 sites, in surface waters, 84% of the samples had Vibrio vulnificus. 34% had parahemolyticus. And the vast majority of the sites that had parahemolyticus was in Bayou Tejar. And again, not because it was polluted, but it had been really, really windy for 4 days prior to us going in Bayou Tejar. Sediments, almost all the samples had vulnificus and parahemolyticus, and they're concentrated really, really high, like 100,000 to 1 million times more than in the water, you know, weight for weight or volume for volume. So that makes sense. If you have a lot of wind kicking through the area and kicking sediment up into the water column, then you're going to have more likelihood of encountering Vibrio after that big wind event. Next slide, please. Next, we're skipping all that. So basically, the bottom line is, in all of these samples, so you can see kind of where we are. We're in northeast Pensacola, Brent area right now. Tejar is just east of us. Escambia County, we just kind of hug the coast. In Escambia Bay and Pensacola Bay, we kind of hug the coast. And then all of those other locations were either urban bayous or hugging the coast to stay on the Escambia County side. In every single one of those map locations, we didn't have a hard time finding Vibrio in the winter. So next slide, please. Skipping that. So if anyone wants the paper or this presentation, I'm happy to email it to you. Keep going. And one more. And this whole thing about, oh, Vibrio is really present in warm, brackish, or salty waters, that's kind of bogus. And that's also reflected in a lot of the other literature from other places, East Coast, you know, the Mid-Atlantic area, other Florida papers as well. But this is the first one that's been done in this whole geographical area at all. So yeah, there is a sweet spot for salinity, but temperature doesn't matter that much. Next slide, please. Because it was more about how much the sediment was getting kicked up into the water column, and or what was the stage of the tide when we happen to be able to be out there. Right? So there's mixing of the Gulf water with the estuary, but also the stage of the tide when we collect it. Next slide, please. And we're skipping that. So this is why you shouldn't freak out unless you're old and decrepit like me. Next slide, please. Yeah, of course, there's going to be more incidences of Vibrio or vibriosis in the summer, and that's true up north or down here. That's because, one, people are out and about more in the summer. They're not out in January. Certainly not up in Delaware. Down here, you know, a little bit more. And two is that the numbers of bacteria, good bacteria and bad bacteria, are always higher. They're like 5 to 10 times higher, just total bacteria in warm waters in July than in the January waters. So yeah, the numbers of Vibrio are going to go up as the water gets warmer, just because total bacteria go up as the water gets warmer. Next slide, please. So yeah, and this is just a case study, but in all of these case studies, and these are kind of old, but in all of these instances where they're looking at an increased prevalence in Delaware, which is where I did my PhD, they were people with risk factors. So again, I think the bottom line, and again, I'm not a medical doctor, but the bottom line is if you think you have risk factors, don't be driving 80 miles in the rain like a fool, like I did. Next slide, please. And next, we're skipping that. So the bottom line of the study was we backed up the method using molecular methods, but we enumerated using classical microbiology. The big ones, of course, were a salinity sweet spot, not necessarily temperature, because these were baseline levels in the winter. Nutrient loads, sketchy, but wind and tidal coefficient were big ones. And next slide, please. Please see the safety guidelines at the Escambia County website, which he showed us earlier. And what else do I have? More tips from CDC on oysters and vibriosis. And if you want any of this, I will email it all to you. And thank you to the students, most of whom are gone, Dr. Jeffrey, Barbara Albrecht, and Dr. Caffrey, who's not here today.
Thank you very much. And we have one more presentation, and we'll be convening our panel for a question and answer. And our next and final speaker is Keith Milley. He's a biological administrator at Florida's Artificial Reef Program. He's been with the Artificial Reef Program for 21 years. And he's been administrator of the program since 2016. He currently administers over $12 million in state and federal grant funds for statewide artificial reef construction, monitoring, and research. He provides technical review and regulatory comment on artificial reef development, coordinates workshops, strategic plans, best management plans to guide and prioritize Florida's artificial reef activities. Prior to joining the Artificial Reef Program, Keith worked with the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, conducting statewide environmental regulatory review of coastal construction projects, including beach renourishment, inlet maintenance, dredging, and mitigation artificial reef construction. Keith initially began his career with the FWC Fisheries Independent Monitoring Program, conducting estuarine fishery sampling along the east central Florida's Indian River Lagoon region. Keith also is the Division Unit's Dive Safety Officer, having logged over 1,000 dives across Florida's Gulf and Atlantic marine habitats during his 28-year tenure with the state of Florida. Keith is originally from Long Island, New York, and received his bachelor's degree from the University of Rochester. Keith, take it away.
Thank you, Robert. And I also apologize for the long bio. I'll try to be quick here. We've been presenting on the Oriskany now, since it was deployed. The Oriskany is 900 feet long. It was launched in 1945, and it was deployed as an artificial reef in May 2006. That means next month it'll be 17 years, Robert, since the Oriskany was deployed. Okay. It's located 23 nautical miles southeast of Pensacola Pass, and it sits at a depth of 212 feet of water. The top of the flight deck is about at 150, and the top of the control tower is about 86 feet depth. So just a little background on PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls. They are persistent organic pollutants. They were banned in the United States in 1979, and they are capable, as you heard from our previous speakers, of bioaccumulating. They're a probable human carcinogen, and the exposure that we are concerned about is for recreational fishers, catching some of these fish that might have some of these bioaccumulated PCBs in there. So as a part of the EPA's approval for the sinking of the Oriskany, in which the Navy wanted to keep the wiring on board, there was extensive toxicological studies that were conducted that allowed that material to stay on board. And as part of the permit to Escambia County and FWC, the monitoring plan established that if the PCB value of 20 parts per billion is not exceeded in 15 or more legal-sized recreational targeted fish of the same species, then no corrective action will be taken. So these materials, as I mentioned, 97.6% of the solid PCBs that were deployed with the Oriskany are located in the cable insulation, and the rest in the paint and bulkhead and gaskets and vents. All of the lubricants were removed. That includes hydraulic fluid on the wooden flight deck that was coming from the aircraft. Once that was discovered, the entire wooden deck of the aircraft was removed. So it was only these solid materials that were left on the boat. Before the Oriskany was deployed, Snyder and Patterson in 2007 did a pre-sink sampling study, and they collected scamp, gag, red grouper, bank sea bass, red snapper, a lot of the same species that you'll see the results that we're sampling. This was within kind of 20 miles of the Oriskany site, and they used trawling and hook and line. And from those fish species, they found a mean 3 parts per billion from those samples. Now, I should also mention, and some of you might already be familiar with the Monsanto site located on the Escambia River. That is 85 kilometers from the Oriskany, of course, well upriver there. And so our post-sink Tier 1 monitoring that we've agreed to with the EPA is that we are sampling annually, 30 recreationally targeted legal-sized fish for 2 years in spring and fall, and then we've been doing annually since. We're analyzing the fillets with skin on, and we're also analyzing all 209 PCB congeners. And again, if the mean PCBs exceeds a screening level of 20 parts per billion, then we will be in consultation with the EPA for Tier 2 sampling. Okay, so the remainder of this talk, I'll talk about the visual inspection and fish census we've been doing. I'll talk about some tagging studies that we did, some additional studies. We'll look at some nearby reef analyses and then collection of PCBs analyses. And I'll try to rush through all this. But I've got a lot of photos here. So this is just one day after deployment. Actually, that's Robert there on the left. I tell you, this picture has gotten so much mileage over the years. It continues to be one of our most requested underwater photos. You could see the great visibility that we had on that day. This is 2.5 months after deployment. We started doing our fish surveys. Then in 2007, a group created these art to media maps, and now this is called Reef Smart, and these have become really popular. So this is a great illustration of what a typical recreational scuba diver might do when you're visiting the Oriskany. And here's examples. Vermilion snapper is a very common fish species that you see at this depth here on the vessel. And here we are, 3.5 years, and we did start to see some significant structural changes, including Tropical Storm Ida in 2009, which kind of blew out some of these panels that were in the exhaust area, and it created that swim through in the middle and of the control tower. And again, vermilion snapper, very popular, common species. Then 10 years after deployment, we started to notice on the flight deck, this started to open up a little bit, and you could see some of the areas where you can look right down into the hangar bay area from the flight deck. And so this is 12.5 years after deployment in 2018, and you see on the top left there, that's that smokestack that's starting to kind of break down a little bit more. And then our most recent dive there was just in October, so 16.5 years, and you can see the flight deck is even a little bit more open, and then again the top of the smokestack is even more open. And just to remind you, that's what it looked like, on the 2 months after deployment. So from our visual fish census, we observed 53 species. I've highlighted in blue those that are targeted fish species by the recreational anglers. And in yellow are those ones that we've analyzed. So we analyze not only all the ones that are targeted by the anglers, but some other ones, in addition. Again, here the red dots show the recreational targeted species. Those two that we didn't analyze are amberjack and shoot, I can't even read the other one. I think they're both amberjack. Almaco-jack, thank you. And those are fish species that, again, spend more of their time above the reef and move around to other places. So to date, we haven't analyzed. Those are the only ones that we haven't analyzed yet. For our sampling to collect these fish, we started out with chevron traps. That was a very labor-intensive endeavor. We ended up losing some traps, had to get some technical divers out there to recover them. We got the red snapper that we needed during that trip. It was also very expensive and very time consumptive. We switched to some bandit rigs here. That helped a little bit. We also implemented some spear fishing. And using these different techniques, our fallback was always just to use our typical rod and reels, and we found that it was quite easy to find volunteer anglers to help us out, and that ended up to be the most efficient way of all the techniques, and it gave us an opportunity to engage with the community and some of our coworkers, and it helped get us the fish that we needed for sampling. I should also point out that we did sample a site, the Pensacola Bay Fishing Bridge. This was a nearby reef that we sampled about 8 miles away. As a comparison, that was once we started to detect some high levels of PCBs at the Oriskany. This is the species composition of the nearby reef that we sampled. 74% red snapper and 13% were vermilion snapper, and then you have those other fish species there. And this is the fish species composition of the samples we collected from the Oriskany. So again, I'm showing you this to show that the species distribution was kind of similar between the two. Okay, and then we're going to talk about the results here: PCB levels, fish length, time, species, tag and recapture data, the different homologs, and then we'll kind of discuss that. So the Oriskany Reef versus that nearby reef, this is where, very quickly you can see that in fact we were detecting PCBs in the Oriskany Reef, but we did not detect any PCBs at that nearby reef. You can see it also, sometimes I reference it as a quote control reef. So looking at the specific fish species, red snapper was our target fish species in the early years, and you could see when we were sampling multiple times a year, we would easily catch 30 fish and head home by noon. And those in the early years were very high, and we were surprised after year 9, that we had some fish that were kind of high. Now, I should also point out that the EPA 20 parts per million here, or picograms per gram, is that threshold that triggers us whether or not we're going to continue sampling. It's not an indication of whether they're, how safe or not they are. In fact, this next slide shows, the EPA acute consumption limit is that 2 parts per million. It's that much higher. So again, these levels that I'm talking about are really an indicator is at the agreement that we have with the EPA. Okay, so some more of the red snapper analyses. I wanted to keep this one in here and the following one because they tell a little bit of a story. This is the PCB levels and the percent lipids. As I think some of our prior speakers presented today, bioaccumulation, it's associated with the percent lipids, the fatty tissue in there. So the more fatty tissue you have, and when you're bioaccumulating, you would expect to have more of the accumulation of those PCBs. Same thing with fish length. You know, as your fish gets bigger and you're bioaccumulating, you would expect to see more PCBs in you. However, what we saw here was that those fish that were 800 millimeters length actually had lower PCB levels than those that were around the 500 millimeter length. And again, the legal size limit here is you know, between 400 and 500 millimeters. Okay, so what this tells us, for me at least, that the PCBs that we were detecting in the fish were coming from a specific area. It was not a result of it being ubiquitously kind of distributed through the entire region or the entire Gulf of Mexico, in which case you would expect as you age, you know, you're continuing to subject yourself to that same PCB level. And to kind of expand on this a little bit, the tagging study that was done by Will Patterson, you know, he tagged over 2,000 red snapper. 8% of those were recaptured, and he found that the mean distance traveled was 24.8 kilometers over 300 with an average of 315 days free. So this kind of shows you how these fish, red snapper specifically, are moving throughout the area. They're not exactly staying on there. So those older fish, that I presented in the previous slide, were actually old. Number one, they were older than the reef itself, but they're also moving around this large area. Okay, so again, so getting back to the 97% of the materials. The wiring, we looked at the, I could probably skip through this, but the fingerprint there is, we were looking at the different homologs. Robert wanted me to touch on this a little bit. We analyzed all 209 congeners. Some of those congeners, some of those homologs of the organochlorides are more carcinogenic than others. And we were also trying to fingerprint the homologs that we were finding in our samples back to the reef materials. However, unfortunately, when the PCBs bioaccumulate, their structures change, and you can't exactly tell, well, this is chemical or what have you is coming from this exact piece of wiring. So that really was not successful for us in that analysis. So here's some other fish species. I showed you the red snapper already. Here's vermilion snapper. All of these samples, were less than the 20 parts per million. So as a result of that, Robert and I's conclusion was that, it was not, there was no benefit to continue to sample vermilion snapper. However, when the numbers of samples for red snapper declined, we ended up sampling other species, and that resulted in us spending more time out there and collecting more red porgy, in which case you see many of these fish species are above that 20 parts per million. And here are some of the other fish species. So we have quite a few. Now, our numbers are very low on some of these, except for scamp grouper, where we did have a sufficient number of numbers for the Department of Health to make a conclusion. But most of these are less than 7 fish, but they were more than the 20 parts per million, in some cases more than the 50 parts per million Department of Health standard. And so more recently, of course, lionfish have emerged as a species that we're seeing regularly across this region. And, this is not a fish species that you would catch hook and line. However, it is a common, and in fact, we promote the harvest and consumption of lionfish. And when it was becoming increasingly difficult for us to find red snapper, we decided to use some of our divers, and we detected the PCBs and the lionfish. So this past fall, in September and October, was the first time where we focused all of our efforts. All 32 fish that we collected were sent to the lab. and the mean of those lionfish was above that 20 parts per million. So in conclusion here, no precinct or nearby reef samples exceeded the EPO threshold of 20 parts per billion. After 3.5 years, the red snapper PCB levels were below the EPA threshold, but then they were elevated in years 7, 9, 10, and 12. No vermilion snapper exceeded the EPA threshold. The remaining analyzed samples represented too few specimens with too great a PCB variability to make any species by species determination initially. Red snapper catch rates have been low since year 8. No red snapper were caught or observed during year 11 sampling efforts, 2 caught during year 12, 8, and we only caught 2 red snapper during year 16. And that's after 8 hours with more than 10 people fishing continuously. So the highest PCB levels we're seeing were in red snapper, scamp, bank sea bass, graysby, red porgy, white-bone porgy. And on June 27, 2017, Department of Health issued the consumption guidelines that Robert mentioned, and that's for bank sea bass, 2 meals per week, and scamp grouper, 1 meal per week. So the catch rates have been dramatically reduced. The fish assemblages have changed, and that's what prompted us to look at lionfish as maybe perhaps a better indicator species that we could more reliably catch. However, those fish are mostly below 150-foot depth, so we're having to implement technical divers to collect those fish. So at this point, we do recommend sampling efforts focus changes to lionfish instead of red snapper, and that's what we're continuing in discussion, and we'll be connecting with the EPA. So with that, this is our concluding slide with the results of the red snapper.
Thank you, Keith. We're going to go ahead and move right into the question and answer because everybody, I'm sure, has been waiting in bated breath for the questions and answers. I'll move some chairs up here if you want to come up, and let's put them so that they can see the Marine Advisory Committee, because Marine Advisory Committee members, I'm sure, are going to have some questions too. Yeah. So, Mr. Chairman, your meeting is yours to recognize your questions and answers.
I would like to thank all of our presenters for educating us on the safety of our seafood and what we need to look out for. Do we have any members of the board that would like to present any questions?
Not a question, but I'd like to thank them all also. Even being a native Pensacolian, born and raised here, and always been on the water one way or the other. Every time I come and we have one of these, you learn. So I appreciate it, and I'm sure the rest of the staff does too. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Denman. Ms. Pino?
Thank you so much. What is this, Kevin? Our 7th one? And I mean, I know that people that have been sitting this board for a lot longer have been, seeing these annually, but we've seen a lot of these, and every year they get better. That's not like blowing smoke. This one was really, really good, so thank you. I guess I can maybe ask these questions in tandem. A couple of them with, and I'm sorry because I don't know your credentials, so it's rude just to say Lisa Wadner. I don't know if that's doctor. And then Michelle Smith with the testing. And then there was just a really simple question that I had for Allison, and I'm sorry, I'm blanking. Robertson. I just wanted to hear from her what a follow-up might have been on the elderly couple that had gone out to dinner and had the chiguatera in the video that we saw last year. I would love to hear how they're doing now. I hope she's doing a lot better. On the testing, finally we have the Vibrio. Finally. Asking for years. And I just wanted to give a shout out to Commissioner Robert Bender, because we wouldn't have had that funding, and I don't think that we would have had the political will to get that testing done if he would not have pushed it through and gotten the vote with the BCC. And so thank you to UWF. I heard about this at a lot of turns from Barbara. Was very anxious to hear the results in Navy Point. Not surprised. So the two questions that I had are about the water temperature, but then also on interagency and university collaboration. Because as disappointing as it is that we're in this spot with the Department of Ag, again, not surprising, it's a little bit frustrating because we rely on DEP a lot, and it's like we can't as a county change some things without state agencies clamping down. And so Department of Ag justifiably comes in and says, okay, we got to do this, but then we don't have any control over some of the pollutants and sedimentation that's going in there as a county. And I don't think that sometimes a lot of constituents know that. But when you were talking about the enormous amount of testing you're doing while you're out there, why not test for Vibrio too?
Our lab doesn't have the capability to test for Vibrio. We've done Vibrio testing on shellfish meat samples before, but we're not required to test for Vibrio for our management plans. The FDA does not require us to test for Vibrio. We have time temperature controls that help regulate the Vibrio. I'm sure the Vibrio control months we have, so harvest is severely restricted in time during the summer. And so that's more on the processing plant side, but we're not required to test for Vibrio. And so the FDA uses fecal coliform as the indicator species. We know Vibrio's out there.
Right.
We know it's there.
Well, and so I'll just say a pipe dream, and then we can all laugh because it's so hard to do anything like that. But wouldn't it be wonderful if while you guys were going around testing using those resources, somebody from UWF could be along for the ride and you guys could be collaborating, because you could get some really interesting data and comparatives on that too. And just the last thought is I just wanted to make sure that I had this right, because Lisa Wadner, because I address this a lot in Navy Point. And I understand what you're saying entirely, is that for the winter months, I think a lot of people were surprised there's that much Vibrio in the water. But it does, as with all bacteria, climb as the water gets warmer. Correct. I just wanted to make sure, because that's the thing that's always scared me to death about Navy Point, is that when those wading waters hit 2 o'clock in the afternoon and you can go out 50 yards and you're only up to your chest, that water is hot. It's bath water. It amazes me people can swim in it. You know, when I was long distance swimming, don't do it anymore there, I couldn't swim if I wasn't in and out by 9 o'clock in the morning. So are there going to be follow-ups? Will you guys, I'm sure, I don't know if you're aware, but the oyster piles are slated for removal. Do you guys currently have funding for this summer even, or next summer?
So the only funding that I have is a graduate student, my new graduate student. She's got a little, like literally $1,500. She's gonna mess around with the molecular work to follow up with the work of the graduate student who is responsible for this paper.
If you guys could get the funding, is the will there to duplicate that study in the summer months? How much money do you guys need?
I don't know. We could talk about like a restricted area, or do 44 again, you know, could kind of pinpoint the ones that were kind of high-ish.
What did it cost you guys to do the extent of the study that you presented tonight, ballpark?
You know,
That's a follow-up, probably.
yeah, that's a follow-up, but we paid graduate student salaries, we paid undergrads.
Right.
All the supplies, the chromometer, that's, so Intracoccus, they run Intracoccus, it's the same kind of high expensive plates. We pour our own plates, you can buy them pre-stacked, even more expensive.
Does the Department of Ag have anything they can apply for? Yeah, okay, thank you.
Do any members of the public have any questions for our panel? Captain?
Well, the speakers really, I think, thoroughly described, back all the way back to the identification of the organisms and the constituents of concerns that are out there, either naturally or in the case of PCBs and mercury. There's been a human contribution of those, and then how we as I say we in the greatest sense of the population of researchers, the government agencies, and the regulations that are made by our elected officials that drive these thresholds. There's a phenomenal amount of work. Is it 100% safe? Absolutely not. I mean, there are numerous examples of conveniences and things that we enjoy as humans on this earth that have risks associated with them. But it's this kind of information that we provide in these symposia, the seafood safety symposia, the diving symposia. We've had beach safety and we've done boating safety. What can we do to do our best to protect ourselves, our families, our loved ones as we recreate and act as organisms on this planet, in this environment? And I really appreciate the people that have presented here tonight. It's a phenomenal education, and it reminded me a lot of what I went to school for. And the status of the science is much more advanced than it was 30 years ago when I was at UWF. And it's just great to see my alma mater doing great work here for the benefit of our community and for our visitors, because we know that our tourism depends upon a safe experience for everyone as we enjoy these waters. So this is not the end. This is a point on the continuum for us as citizens of Escambia County, for me as a Marine Resources Manager, for the Marine Advisory Committee, as you identify issues and recommendations to take to the Board of County Commissioners. So I really appreciate, and we do have Dr. Farzad is still on the line, so hopefully she can hear this message of deep appreciation. There's a lot of handouts that are on the back, thanks to Rick and the partners at the Escambia County Extension Service and UF-IFAS. The final thing that I would say before you adjourn, if we could just talk to a couple of the items that we need to talk about tonight before you adjourn, but we definitely want to give you a round of applause. We thank the folks in the audience that have stuck through and
Robert, well done on you. That's a great panel you put together.
Yeah, this is. I was mentioning to Keith that I guess doing it as long as I have, I've identified some great speakers, and I met Michelle at a local oyster stakeholders meeting just this year, and I realized that she was a perfect match for what we need here. And of course, with University of West Florida being our back door, our backyard, and having the funding from the county, it was a great way to show how the county and our research and educational institutions can work together for the betterment of our community. So thank you all very much. So, Mr. Chairman, if you would.
Yes, Mr. Moore has a question for the panel.
This is a little bit off subject, but maybe not. Since we have y'all here, y'all may be the only ones that can really answer my question. This influx of unusually large influx of sargassum grasses coming in, is that going to affect the algae growth and along our coastline? I know it's going to affect my fishing. it's not much fun out there with a line full of sargassum grass. It's, but could you answer, have y'all thought about that or questioned that? No, well, I just thought I'd take a shot, yeah, maybe.
Kind of, because all of them are shading each other out, right?
Mhm.
So if
Right.
you think about like just a big cyanobacteria algae bloom, that's gonna kill the seagrasses below.
Mhm.
Use them light, they're all plants. They're floating plants, they're fixed plants. So the sargassum may actually reduce your HABs.
Mhm.
Perennial kind of.
Okay, that's it.
Because you have bigger stickiness than
Yeah.
HABs.
Yeah, it seems like somebody would be making a study on that right now. I mean, I think in a lot of places they use it for fertilizer. You know, they harvest it up, and God knows we could use that around here. That's a little bit of sarcasm.
You can harvest sargassum, I believe you have to get a permit from FWC though. I think so, yeah. But only once it's orange. It's either FWC or DEP.
So you can't fish it in the water without a permit?
I'm not sure.
Mr. Conrad.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I appreciate you staying in here and your stamina as well, and the audience as well. Thank you very much for showing up and sticking it out tonight. Interesting histories, the PCBs, the whole Vibro monitoring and things. But going forward, are these programs set to continue? I mean, you mentioned it's going to go on for 20 years past the Oriskany deployment. So that's going to look at an end at some point. And the monitoring for the Bay system for Enterococcus.
We can monitor for fecal.
Right, fecal coliform, you're right. I mean, is that planned to just go continuously? Is there a sunset for any of these? That's a continuous thing?
That should be continuous, that's mandated by the
Okay.
FDA.
And
Safety, consumption safety.
and Vibro as well with the sites? No.
That's not, we
No, that's not a money thing, okay. So the question is as we make changes and we deploy reefs and we deploy other living shorelines and things like Project Green Shores along the bayfront, and things like that. In the next one, and I noticed the manager is gone now, but the Pensacola Bay living shoreline, the 3 sites there, would it not benefit us to focus in on some data collection both before deployment of those and after, to look forward? And that may be a recommendation that we can carry forward to see if we can get some, help, money, as in money, to focus on doing those kinds of things. Specifically, if we have, some of the algal content and you can do the swabs of the shellfish and the things that are going to grow there. I mean, that would be, I think, very enlightening as we go forward. Something we should pursue? Okay, thank you.
Glenn, just a quick piggyback. I love that idea, and we've talked so much about maybe what little place we could find that we could argue to be environmentally involved with the BCC in a way that's not going to upset the apple cart. This is something they've already funded, so it seems like it would be pretty easy for us to just piggyback on the original and also let UWF, let the experts be the determinators. I mean, and I love your idea of the before and after. I did beg for that in Navy Point, but why couldn't we write a letter from us saying that we want more of the same funding that UWF got the first round to continue their work? It's, the template's already there.
Sure, I think that we should. That would be a fine thing to do. I think we should make it focused on where we want it and what we want to look for, though. I mean, you got to scope it. You got to scope the funding, and that's probably with some consultation on how much it would take. And rather than drone on about that for forever tonight, maybe we should let people go home. But yeah, I'd go for that.
Once again, I'd like to thank all of our experts that presented to us tonight. Robert, I would ask that that staff gather the email addresses and links to these different sites that we had, that we can maybe incorporate those or publish them in our next set of minutes. So I'm sure there's a lot of people that would like to go and look at for example, the site that says you can have, you know, the allowed consumption for different types of fish and those other resources that are valuable to the public.
Yes, we'll put the speakers, the bios that they provided us and their email addresses, and then the slides that had the links to them, we'll get those over to the
And
secretary.
we're recording tonight too,
Yeah.
correct?
And, pardon me?
We're recording tonight as well?
Yeah,
Is that correct?
always,
Okay.
yeah, yeah.
So that'll be on the
Is
site.
that just gonna go online, Robert? The video and the
There,
PDFs and the-
yeah, there's no video. We're doing our usual recording is all audio recording, but all of
The
the.
Teams was recording.
No. What we'll do is we'll provide all of the presentations tonight were given to us in digital format, so those will be put online with the minutes.
Okay, thank you. All right, do we, let's see, public forum, do we have any members of the public that would like to come forward and speak? Ready? Name and address, please.
Very quickly, Brady Hale, 2436 Gulf Breeze Avenue. I just want to remind everybody that our big gala, fundraising gala for Ocean Strike Team, April 29th at the Hilton. I've got some cards and invitations for you guys. Would love to see y'all there. It's our major fundraiser to do this kind of stuff. But I wanted to talk to you guys specifically. I have a nonprofit called Ocean Strike Team. We're based here in Pensacola. We have a large volunteer base, and we just bought our own boat. So we're going to be able to take researchers and experts out. We're already working with NOAA on a harmful algal bloom program here in the Bay, so would love to work with you guys, maybe cut some costs and help out with some stuff like that. That's all I got.
Outstanding, thank you. Does anyone else from the public have any updates, questions, comments? All right, I think the only other item that we have is, as I had stated earlier, were nominations and elections of officers of our board, and I'd like y'all to think about that, and we're going to table that until next meeting, given the late hour currently. So that being said, do we have a motion to
Hang
adjourn?
on, if you
I'm
would,
sorry.
please. Yeah, there's a couple of events that are coming up. This Saturday, the 15th, in this room, we're going to have another diving safety meeting focusing on the chambers and the trends of losing chambers and hopefully how we can turn that trend around. And that'll be this Saturday, 9 o'clock in this room here. And then Sunday, there's a gala at the beer garden. Brady, y'all are going to be at the beer garden on Sunday, the 16th?
Correct, yes. Marine Conservation Day at Gary's Beer Garden. Have a lot of the conservation groups going to be there. So just talk to the public, have some vendor booths, and come out, have fun, live bands, and food trucks, all this stuff.
Yeah, and we'll be there. We'll be there as well. Marine.
Will you state where it is again?
It's the is Gary's Beer Garden, right? On yes,
And
on the way to.
What time is that at?
Noon to 6.
And then also, we have issued our formal notice to proceed on the boat ramp on Perdido Bay. So the construction is imminent on that. And again, just thank y'all very much for being here tonight, all the members of the Marine Advisory Committee, the ones that were not able to be here tonight. I'm sure they're going to regret missing this great set of presentations. And thanks once again to our panels. And for those of you who traveled here, Keith and Melissa, Michelle, that there's a great advantage to us, and we hope that it was an advantage for y'all as well. Then one final thing is that we have received the results of the solicitation for the artificial reef grant, the $1.16 million grant. There was one respondent, and that was Walter Marine. We'll have a meeting tomorrow morning with the selection committee and Walter Marine to do the final negotiation. And this is for the NRDA, the Natural Resources Damage Assessment funded patch reefs, the memorial reefs that Eileen Beard funded, and then a $60,000 grant for the Escarosa Regional Reefs, a partnership between the state and Escambia and Santa Rosa counties. So we'll be building more reefs very, very soon. And just thank y'all for all of y'all's work as ambassadors into the community and back to us as local subject matter experts. Can't thank y'all enough. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Outstanding. Thank you, Robert, and thank you to our experts. Do we have anyone with a motion to adjourn?
As per tradition, I motion to adjourn.
Mr. Green, do we have a second? Mr. Denman, all in favor? Aye.